Fanatic, you wanted to do this conversation. Systemic oppression, systemic racism. I guess I'll give the floor to you to introduce the subject.
Well, for sure. What I would have preferred, honestly, would have been to have this conversation 1v1, but it doesn't matter. 2v2s can work. I think the conversation last time we kind of got in, and we were talking about data in a particular study. And I felt like I really wanted to have a conversation more just about the broad topic of systemic oppression in general. And I guess kind of maybe like discussing whether or not systemic oppression still has an impact today. And I think a lot of times we tend to focus on like historic systemic oppression. But then I think when we start talking about now, a lot of time people are almost like they want to dismiss the idea of systemic oppression's impact or its prevalence today. And so I felt like we could just kind of have a broad conversation about that. I wanted us to get into specifics, but I guess there wasn't that much communication back and forth, so we didn't get there. So I guess we'll just see where the conversation takes us.
All right, awesome. Yeah, I apologize. I've had a hectic few weeks, so it's been pretty sparse with the communication. But I guess I'll just put my position on the topic to the floor, and then Destiny and Sean can go. Basically, last time we discussed this, we talked about the racism of the gaps, how in a lot of data that comes out about racial disparity, people will fill it with racism instead of other potential factors. And for the most part, I do think in America and Canada rather, we have fulfilled a lot of these obligations in ensuring people have equality under the law, equality of a starting point, not necessarily equality of outcome. That's something I don't think you can ensure for any group, whether it be gender, race, religion. I don't think we can ensure equality of outcome, but within the systems that be, within the legal, educational, all of these different aspects of our culture, I do think it is very fair towards all ethnic and racial groups. And a lot of systemic oppression is unfortunately exaggerated for the sake of groups that have a vested interest in, quite frankly, minorities not succeeding, because that is where they get their profit from. That is where their activism comes from. And so they have a vested interest in exaggerating systemic oppression.
Am I next? Oh, wait.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here to talk about systemic oppression. A little bit short notice, but I'll be focusing, I guess, on the criminal justice side of things. I know that I think we tend to get pretty deep into studies here. So the two I'll be going over, the main one will be the Nature one with the 100 million whatever police stops. And then there's a 2002-2011 special report from the DOJ for the police use of non-fatal force. And I guess we can walk through that one. Those are the two things I brought to the table today.
Right. All right, is it my turn? Because I set up my thing finally. All right, so typically when we talk about systemic oppression, Lauren is right. We do discuss racism of the gaps. We find disparities, and there's like a core fallacy because we're all good people and we want better outcomes for everybody, that absent disparity, we would expect equal outcome be among groups. But what we see time and time again when we delve into these numbers is that the behaviors of the groups are different, and nowhere throughout history have we seen this equal outcome among these various groups. And it's kind of absurd when you think about it that you want something similar in terms of outcome when the behavior, the inputs, are nowhere near the same. So yeah, I reject this notion.
Okay, so really quickly, first off, I guess anything can be exaggerated, right? So I would definitely agree with you that there are bad actors, like, you know, some people who would exaggerate very much how much systemic oppression is still prevalent and how much of an impact it has today. But I think in the other side of that, you have people on the right who I would say would probably be incredibly dismissive to how important or how impactful systemic oppression that exists today is. I would say the idea that we've like achieved equality under the law, I guess from a really broad stance, that sounds to like it could be true. But then when you start like really delving into like what actually happens immediately following some of the best civil rights acts or civil rights movements that we have, then you'll find that maybe on a broad federal level that we will get some sort of equality of the law. But then at the state level, they immediately start passing various laws meant to kind of like skirt the whatever the federal law is. So for example, in like Brown versus Board of Education, like sure, like they immediately passed like a law basically saying, hey, like yeah, you guys can, you can go, separate but equal is not fair. You guys, integration is necessary. But then Brown 2, which was like 2 years later, I want to say, they passed something saying basically, well, they can kind of take their time as they find a way of implementing this. And then you see like almost every state in the South introduce these pupil placement laws, which were upheld by the Supreme Court, which basically say, hey, you guys can choose where your students go. The state can elect a council to decide where students go, and then using that we can like look and see like 10 years later and less than 2% of the total black population in these states were in integrated schools. So even though there was inequality under the law, the federal law, at the state level we saw how much they went to like kind of undermine that, right?
Or were you asking me? Yeah, was that
directed
towards?
That was just to the room.
A specific question for someone. Okay,
it wasn't a question. I'm just saying, like, would you think that from that you would be able to glean the information that even though we might have something like equality of the federal law, the various states can still do things, and then institutions can still do something that will still have like disparate outcomes, right?
Well, disparate outcomes aren't evidence of discrimination.
You're right. I'm sorry.
Evidence of different outcomes. So, but in terms of they passed laws and then at the state level to try to prevent segregation, I'm not denying that happened, or try to prevent the repeal of segregation. I'm not denying that happened. But by contrast, we also have situations where they implement federal busing programs, and this causes people to move out of those areas so that they can avoid having their kids bused for miles. So like that ended up leading to white flight. So in a way, like whichever direction you went, like you were leading to some kind of people deciding themselves to self-segregate, which is not unusual throughout our history. So like it's not just them trying to prevent it at the state level. Sometimes it's sometimes it's parents like reacting to the fact that they don't want their kids bused to other places, preventing this from happening. This is why in like the Northeast we have schools that are more segregated than schools that are than schools in the historic South to this day, because people moved away.
Well, okay. So the thing is, there's a difference between like maybe when you want to talk about like individuals making a decision to move their children and things like that, then that might be a problem, and I mean that can be a factor. But clearly, you have to be able to look at the laws that were literally designed with the intention.
I'm talking about the laws. So you brought up how people in the South, and we know this, right? The Eisenhower administration had to send the military to forcibly desegregate schools.
No. But that's not addressing what I specifically brought up about pupil placement laws.
Okay, so just let me finish my point. So yeah, there are laws that try to do an end around of Brown versus Board of Education. I'm not denying that. But on the inverse, when we had federal intervention to try to uphold and like enforce integration in our schools, that also had the opposite reaction. So is it only laws with bad intent or bad outcome that we're looking at?
I would say laws with bad outcome, and sometimes I would totally agree with you that there are laws that people could create with the intention of doing something in order to help a situation that could have a negative impact. But then some laws are literally. If I can finish my point really quickly. If I can finish my point.
It's bad. It's important because
you asked me to let you finish your point, so please let me finish mine really quickly. What I was going to say specifically was that if you have pupil placement laws, those things, there's a difference between laws that were created with the intention of having a separate outcome. And some of these laws were literally designed specifically to make sure that segregation continued. Now, yes, if you want to talk about some of the busing situation that like might have contributed to a problem, I'm more than willing to concede that. And I would say that outcome is probably detrimental and it's a problem. But what I'm talking about is the existence of, this wasn't the crux of the argument. The whole point was just to demonstrate specifically that even though we might create federal laws, equality of laws, that we will still find that there are individual laws and institutions, large-scale institutions, that will then create problems so as to prevent the law from being carried out.
Okay, so, I mean, you switched it from intention to outcome. Like, I was asking you, if it's the outcome that's worse, that's what I was going to ask you, then the Northeast would be more systemically racist than the historic South. But then in your response, like you switched it to intention. So like, I mean, Yeah, laws that intend to be racist, like that's actively the goal, like they're bad and you shouldn't have that.
Okay, sure, but I would say also, like, it depends on what the cause of that outcome is. Simply because there's an outcome that's
Wait,
probably.
can I ask a question to get us, because we're both kind of, I see where you guys are both going. Let me see if I can like elucidate here. Okay, let's say that we made a law right now, and that law banned, or that law caused the imprisonment of every single person that did drug X. Now, let's say 50% of black people do drug X, so they're put in jail, and 10% of white people do drug X, so they're put in jail. Would we consider this law to be a form of systemic oppression? Why or why not? For either of you. I don't care who goes first.
Well, if the law is neutral, I wouldn't. Just because you have disparate outcomes doesn't mean that it's a systemic oppression. I mean, like black Americans commit over 50% of the murders every year. So like criminalizing murder doesn't mean that it's a systemic oppression.
Sure. So here's like my next question. So typically when we think, so we have on one end, we have like racism, which is boring. We all know that it's bad. I think generally in the US, we do it okay. There's not people running around like screaming the N-word at people or like generally speaking, not all the time, but generally speaking. Okay. But when you think of it in terms of like systemic oppression, okay, let's say that I throw another stat and I say that all the people that go to jail for drug X, they're going to be locked up for the rest of their life. And let's say that it's only men that do this drug. So now we got 50% of black men and we've got 10% of white men. Now, let's say that we also know, now I'm making up stats here, but it's kind of reflective of reality. Let's say that we also know that if you are from a single parent household with only mothers, you're like way more likely to be a criminal than if not. Would we now consider that same law before that was neutral because it's just targeting people that do drug X and black people happen to do it more? But if we enact this law and we enact all the punishments behind it, and we know that it's going to cause the next generation of people to also have like a higher proclivity for crime, would we consider that a form of systemic oppression? And then yes or no or why? I'm curious.
I mean, if you're trying to criminalize behavior, now I'm not like a drug warrior kind of guy, and like you're trying to like do an end around example for the crack cocaine disparities, which I mean specifically there's no case there, but yeah, no, it's not like that would not be considered systemic oppression. And your men example is perfect. We know that 90% of the laws are enforced against men, like they commit the overwhelming majority of crimes, and nobody makes the case, I would hope, for systemic sexism against men.
I mean, I would.
Well, there's plenty of people that do. I do as well.
Yeah, I would absolutely do that, especially in cases of violent crime, especially in cases of domestic abuse.
Sure.
Women get away with a lot of insane shit.
We see the same thing in child court as well.
Yeah, I guess so. Going back, and we haven't gotten into any data yet or any studies, but this is just kind of like the meta philosophy of this conversation. I guess the problem is that if we were to send like a train down the tracks of society, and this is kind of the system that we made, where at the very beginning we have like a neutral law that doesn't racially target anybody, but it does have disparate outcomes. If those disparate outcomes will into the future propel groups into different directions, it feels like that you could argue that that is a form of systemic oppression. If we assume that children don't choose to be fatherless, which I assume we all agree with that, and you have children that are born into households that are fatherless, and then those children go on to have, just statistically speaking, a much higher proclivity for crime, like do we hold those individuals accountable? Do we hold the single mothers accountable? Do we hold the system accountable? Like where does the buck stop, I guess, and how do we push forward into like correcting the imbalance or righting the ship? Or do we think it doesn't even need to be righted at all? We think that it's okay to just
you would hold the individuals accountable. So again, like if your father committed murder and you're raised in a single parent household and your father's in prison, yeah, that's difficult for you. Like that's what we would call a cosmic injustice, right? Like you didn't choose to have a father that was a murderer and be set up in that way. But we're not going to call it oppression when we punish the person who murdered somebody else. Like that doesn't make any sense. And it shouldn't be policy to punish people living today for the sins of the past.
Well, okay, hold on. I think this is where the conversation always gets a little heavy. If we can bring this into the topic that I wanted, like one of the things that obviously we always talk about, right, which is redlining, right? Like when we start talking about redressing of a lot of the civil things that have happened in the past, it's not necessarily about like, oh, we're just punishing you for things that are happening in the past. We would only be trying to redress things that, well, most of the time, we would want to redress things that have an impact today. So when we look at redlining, it's not just about, oh, this is awful that you did this in the past. It's more about what is the impact of that redlining on society today, and then we would look at that and say.
So can I ask a question here? do you believe, because a lot of what we're talking about is historical examples of things that potentially impact today, but do you believe that there are systems in place right now within the government, laws in place that are systemically against Black people, like in place right now?
Of course, I would say some of the voting laws that they've like enacted are probably going to be somewhat harmful, specifically aimed at
So
Black
like
people.
voting ID?
No, it's not just voting ID. So what you find is that, I mean, I guess you would need to look at each individual one, but there have been obvious cases like the North Carolina one, which is one that's often cited, where that was a law that was made, literally never said the word Black, but clearly they asked for voting.
Can you explain that?
Sure. So what it was is they went and they asked for voting data by race. After obtaining this data by race, they then decided to restrict the various ways that African Americans disproportionately voted. And then they created laws around that in order to target the Black vote. And so when the Supreme Court struck that down, they used the word and said that you guys asked for voting data by race and then targeted the Black vote with surgical precision because they really
So what did they shut down? What methods of voting did they shut down that they found in this study were proportionally...
Okay, wait, so let me for background on this real quick. So the state legislature requested very specifically a racial breakdown of where people were voting, and then they kind of targeted like the ways in which Black people were voting. So for instance, I believe that they cut early voting, which was a way that Black people predominantly voted, from like 13 days to 7. They found like predominantly Black used voting booths that they ended up like closing down. It was a pretty egregious thing where when the Supreme Court said it, that's like a quote, I think. I don't know if it was the Supreme Court or if it was the state Supreme Court of North Carolina, but they said that it was like they were surgically targeting Black voters to try to shut down their ability to vote in elections, essentially.
Well, I have like, I don't know the specifics of the North Carolina law, but I have questions about redlining. If you would want to entertain a few of those. So when was the redlining period? Like when was this law in effect?
Well, redlining pretty much started in the 1930s, and it existed all the way until I guess until 1968 is when they passed the Fair Housing Act, which of course that kind of like skirted some of the issues with redlining because like at that point there were plenty of places where segregation was required. So then Black people couldn't buy homes in the white neighborhoods, but then the banks were also restricting them from getting loans in the Black neighborhoods. But with the passing of the Fair Housing Act, then they ended up creating a rule that basically said you cannot have discriminatory lending practices.
Right. So 1934 to 1968. So what was the effect on Black home ownership during that period of time?
Oh, it was incredibly detrimental. I mean, I guess I guess it's really hard because it's hard to look at this information without looking at the outcomes. But we can obviously.
I mean, what was like? Did home ownership rates go up? Did they go down? Did they grow as fast as home ownership rates over the same period for white people, or did they grow significantly slower? Like that's what I'm asking.
Well, they clearly just didn't grow as fast as the white home ownership did. And the neighborhoods in which Black people lived, the value of their properties depreciated greatly because they weren't able to maintain these neighborhoods.
I mean, I would have to fact check you on that. If you look at U.S. Census data, Black home ownership rose during this specific period of time at the same rate as white home ownership. You also this also coincides with Black poverty dropping from 89% to 49%. Yeah, I'll pull it up. And they use census data. You could see it on the charts. I've covered this multiple different times in my video.
Sure.
So, like, my question is, and I'm not saying that there was no impact, obviously, but like, if like this law was so destructive to Black people, so much so that we feel it today, why did their homeownership's rate of increase slow so dramatically after the repeal, as opposed to the time that the law was in effect?
I think that something that would be really important to look at for that, I don't have a strong position on this because it's just not something I'm as well read in, but I don't think that looking at only home ownership is the only thing that matters. My understanding, and I could be totally wrong on this, but my understanding was that the term red line, I think, referred to specific lines where it was like black people are not going to live in this neighborhood. So I don't think that the policies related to redlining specifically prevented black people from getting homes. It just prevented them from getting nicer homes in areas where they might otherwise want to live, but rather they were forced to other neighborhoods. So for instance, this is just like a random snippet out of a Forbes article, and I can shoot you this. This is from last year. The typical homeowner in a neighborhood that was redlined for mortgage lending by the federal government has gained 52% less, or $212,000 less, in personal wealth generated by property value increases than one in a green line neighborhood over the last 40 years. So like so black home ownership might have increased, but maybe they were kind of shitty homes, or they didn't get approved for the mortgages to get into better homes that they wanted to. And that increase in wealth is only tied to the property value. So that increase in wealth is going to be irrespective of like a job you might have worked otherwise. Just as a aside there, I'll throw that into Discord.
Sorry, before we jump forward, I just want to mention this North Carolina bill. I haven't had the time to go through it properly, obviously, but it does seem like a lot of it is around photo identification. I just want to clarify, do you guys think that photo identification for voting is racist?
To be very clear, that North Carolina ID law had almost nothing to do with voter ID. It was.
I've got it open here, and the first sections are about it. And when I was reading the articles, that brought it up. But
that it might be mentioned in some articles. We can do a whole separate conversation on this. This is one of those things that we've been over so much. But like the problem wasn't necessarily the voter ID. I think the big problem, there's a name for this legally, I think, where you show bad intent. But it was that the state legislature was requesting from polling areas specific racial breakdowns, and they were cutting out methods of voting literally related to where black people vote. And then even more specifically to the ID thing, there were specific forms of IDs that were previously allowed to be used that they were barring, whether they were expired or not, that were predominantly used by black people. It wasn't just like them trying to instate a voter ID.
Then
this is even if we do agree or disagree with voter ID, which I could see good arguments for voter ID, the North Carolina law is really, really, really bad. It got shut down rightfully so. I think everybody conservative.
I'll take your word for that. I'll just take your word for that. I assume that what you're saying is accurate about this. Then it's a good thing that it was struck down, and it appears like our legal systems are working the way they should in ensuring that systemically racist policies are not in place, correct?
Well, okay, so that's the beauty of this, right? Is that, yes, so this is an example in which the Supreme Court of that state ended up striking it down. But obviously you see all of the various laws that they've enacted recently in Georgia, and I don't have these off the top of my hand.
What's wrong with the Georgia law?
I mean, I'm sorry, not Georgia specifically. It's just a bunch of different states have ended up like creating laws specifically aimed at like what I guess I've always heard is voter suppression. I don't know about those specific laws, so I guess that's not like a hill that I will die on. But I think if we want to talk about like back to the mortgage thing, right? First off, I'll say this really quick. I don't think voter ID in and of itself sounds like a terrible idea. It sounds like it would actually be a great idea. If it was me and I was just thinking of it, I would probably say that makes a bunch of sense. But what we end up discovering is that in some cases, what they end up doing is shutting down the DMV in various areas like where black people live. So then black people have to travel. I think in one case, I remember that there was a case where they had to travel 40 miles in order to access the DMV. And so then it's not just the idea.
Is that considered far? Because in rural parts of the country, traveling for 40 miles to go get groceries isn't considered far.
Okay, hold on. Just to be clear, traveling 40 miles to get groceries in any part of the U.S. is considered far.
Yeah, that didn't
40 miles is a long way. As somebody that came from Nebraska and literally took horseback riding lessons at a fucking farm, if you're driving 40 miles to get groceries, you're really far from anything. Now, I will be clear, I haven't been to like Montana or whatever, but like in Nebraska and Iowa, there are definitely small towns, but like these small towns will usually have like a grocery store or something in them. It's pretty rare that you're actually like 2 hours or like an hour away from it. Might happen in super, super remote areas, but for the most part, that's going to be pretty rare.
I mean, there's no there's no Walmart where I live, except for one that's like over an hour away. And if I want to go to the Walmart, then it would take me longer, even though since I live in New York, it's more densely populated. It would take me longer to travel there than it would if you get on the highway for 40 miles. Like, so I mean,
sure, but I mean, like
that's just far.
I might have heard, maybe I heard incorrectly, but in terms of being near any grocery store, 40 miles is pretty prohibitive. Now, maybe like specifically like a Walmart. I think other stores in Walmart sell groceries, but yeah, I mean, like certain stores could be far away, sure.
Well, if you're living in a small town of like 10,000 people that can't sustain a grocery store, typically there's a grocery store in between the two towns that's pretty far.
Okay, so just to be clear, hold on, I just want to be super clear.
I'm just saying, is that
people,
like
10,000 people is not a small town? There's absolutely
is this like a highly urban area where a lot of people where a lot of people typically use public transportation? Because it depends, like how far you have to travel it depends. Like in terms of miles, like where you are. That's what I'm asking. I don't know North Carolina very well.
Oh, in terms of like how far do you have to travel to get to a polling booth or whatever?
No. He said to the DMV, because you have to go to the DMV to renew your driver's license once every 8 years.
It varies by state, and it's not just about the idea becomes like very often, that's why I said from the very beginning, I think the idea of like having an identification for voting, it sounds reasonable to me. I think most black people have an ID. It like sounds like something that would be reasonable, but it seems like these things are always bottled with other things, and it seems like, or in previous instances, there were some cases where people were doing things like that. There's already a lot of states that already require voter IDs, right? Like a lot of states. So like this isn't like something that's completely unheard of. It's just that it seems like some of the bad actors who were trying to create voter IDs were creating some problematic they were doing things with it. And really one more thing. And when it came to even like things like that were inside of the North Carolina law, I think one of them had to do with out of district voting. And so you'll find things like, for instance, like the one that they passed in Georgia recently, where they barred out of district voting, but then they ended up so then the lines for some people to vote. I remember at one point where some people had to wait 10 hours in line in order to vote, but they couldn't go to the other districts which weren't as filled. And then now, of course, they're passing laws basically saying you can't give people water to vote, which sounds a little bit ridiculous.
No. That's totally wrong.
I'm sorry, so that the workers campaign,
a specific campaign was offering water and cookies, and it was the candidate, and that was considered electioneering by the polling booth. That's always been forbidden. You're not allowed to do electioneering near the polling booth. So, especially if you're a candidate, you can give people water just generally, but you're not supposed to electioneer. That's one of the myths about the Georgia law. Like the reason they banned this is because they were like, oh, well, the candidate was using that as an excuse, but it's literally the candidate giving you something as you go into the polls. Like I live in New York. We don't have voter ID or anything like that. You can't have the campaign signs on the same block as the polling station.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Are you allowed
normal at all?
So now with the law as it stands right now, are poll workers, the people who just work at the poll, are they allowed to hand out water to any of the people that are standing in line?
I would assume that they would be.
Okay, so again, I don't know why we got stuck on voter ID. That wasn't my real goal. To my understanding, it wasn't allowed.
Let me come back real quick. I'm just curious for everybody in here, okay? Because this is it's always such a weird talking point. Would everybody in here be okay with a two-pronged thing, that everybody needs a federally issued ID or state-issued ID to vote, but two, everybody was guaranteed to have one of these issued to you at no cost, like to a residence or whatever? Does everybody here agree with both parts of that?
Sure.
I mean, in six of the states where they have voter ID, they literally give a free option. So
there are how many states have voter ID though? Okay,
six of the
sure.
With some form of
I think it's like 32.
Typically, they have a free option.
Okay, sure. I think the reason why people get hung up is that, like, if you're going to put a blockade in front of somebody to vote, you need a really good reason to do that, even however minuscule the blockade might be or the block might be. But I think that, like, if conservatives wanted to pair the voter ID idea with, like, hey, well, we're going to start issuing IDs to everybody. Like, there's a lot of European countries where you need an ID, a federally issued ID to vote. But if you issue it for free, I don't think there's as much of a problem there. I hope we all agree with that.
Yeah,
right?
I think you can give a non-driver's ID to people for free in the state, especially if you have voter ID.
For sure. And just to be clear, that if that number of 6 is accurate, it's kind of crazy because there's 35 states that require ID to vote. So I think, yeah, just the introduction.
Well, hold on. Real clear, in terms of requiring ID, it might be varying forms of identification because different, like I know, for instance, for North Carolina, I only know this because of the voter law they try to put in, like some states will accept like a student ID or like an expired ID, which is not really like a strict ID. So it might depend on like what kind of IDs different states accept, right?
Sure. That makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
To pivot here, can I bring up a question? So we're talking about bringing in laws that maybe we can't necessarily improve intent, or some we can improve intent to discriminate against certain groups, but either way, the result of the law is one ethnic group loses out, whether it be in arrests or voting, whatever it may be. What do you guys think of laws that a lot of people would consider systemically racist against whites? So like hiring laws in which we're trying to reduce the amount of white males in a certain sphere, whether it be military positions, policing positions, or government positions. Even in Canada, for example, we wanted to have 50% females in Trudeau's cabinet, I believe it was. Do you think that those are a form of systemic oppression?
I think for political positions, I think that is absolutely valid because your political system should be some form of representation of your people. Now, I think that there are arguments to support it. There are valid arguments to support it. Personally, I don't like the idea of like rigidly forcing a certain like group of people that have to be voted on by your own like constituents or whatever. Like, so if you wanted to vote for a man but you can't because you're not allowed to because you've got to fill the cabinet or whatever with something else. Or I don't know how Canada runs its elections. So I mean that's a little bit weird. But like I think you can make stronger arguments for it publicly. Privately, I think it's cringe to try to enforce like you have to have one woman or you have to have like 20% or whatever representation, at least for private companies. I think federally, I think you can make stronger arguments because you might be able to argue that your federal body of employees should be somewhat representative of the country that you're from, kind of like how police officers should look like the communities they're policing. But on a private property thing, like I think that's probably not enforceable.
So do you think that 50% of the US government should be female and that should be enforced?
In terms of like national jobs, I don't know if it should be enforced, but I like making policies that like encourage that type of hiring. It's pretty obvious we can guide people with different types of encouragement. I don't think that's the worst thing in the world. I don't know how I feel about it. I have to think about it more, but I could see an argument for it government-wise because it is kind of weird depending on the world you live in. Like if you have like a 60% white population and a 50% male population and like 95% of federal employees, I don't know if that's a real number, but if 95% were like white men, you get kind of a weird engagement with your government there where it feels like it's not as representative of you as it might otherwise be.
What if I was putting together like a task force to deal with the virus? Should I be like, white scientists, get the hell out. I need some diversity up in here.
That sounds ridiculous.
I wish I had this offhand, but there are very strong arguments to be made for having different voices in rooms when you're dealing with like certain types of issues. I can't speak specifically to the pandemic because I would hope that people that are in those positions are qualified enough to keep things in mind. But there are a lot of like almost unbelievably stupid oversights that are made if you get like a certain like very homogenous group of people that are like making decisions. For instance, we've seen like the was it like the Canon printers or photographs that can't detect black faces, or like the automatic hand drying machines that don't see black hands. Like you see dumb shit like that happen, probably because there are like way too many white people working the project, or they haven't incorporated at the very least like diverse enough train of thought to like understand how these products might work with people that don't look like them.
Also, I would say really quickly,
understanding some of these products, it's literally like impossible. So like for example, an IPL machine, which so like hair removal machines that women use to remove hair on their legs, it actually doesn't work on pigmented skin. That's just how it works because it detects the pigment in the hair that it removes. So even like super blonde people, it won't really work on. So if you're like a ginger, it won't work on. And if you're very dark skinned, this technology won't work on you because it will burn your skin as it tries to remove the pigment, which typically is in the hair. So I don't know if we can assert, I'd have to look into it more as well, but I don't know if we can assert the technology being made is not working on certain people just because it's white people working on it. Sometimes that's just how technology works.
No. Hold on, really quickly. That's a straw man, though, because our idea wasn't specifically that like it's not like literally every time it's going to be happening this way, but there are times where we can obviously see where people from a specific representation might be a little bit more informed about a given topic, such that someone could be making a decision that's going to disparately affect different groups, and so then the person from that in group would be able to have an idea of like, wait a minute, this sounds good for y'all, but in reality for us, this might have some of these disparate outcomes. It's not about necessarily blaming all technology in all cases or any of that. It's just more of a broad idea that there are times in which having multiple voices in a room can influence things in a positive direction. We see this in like education, where like obviously a more diverse learning environment tends to be a little bit more productive, and things like that. But it's not. This isn't an injunction against all technology. I don't know that he was just making a broad idea. It sounded like
it's a bit of an assertion that perhaps this problem could be fixed if we had more diversity in the room, and I just wasn't necessarily sure that that was the conclusion we should come to without looking into more.
In some instances.
Why.
Yeah, in some, like they're going to be like, so what you talk about for laser hair removal is true. If you have very blonde and very fine skin, I don't think it works. You can't do it. But if you've got darker hair, if you've got fairer skin, like you can use these laser hair removal products for people to do these things. but that's like an elective thing that's like nice to do, but it's not like essential. But if you're putting like hand drying machines in a bathroom, it should probably be a requirement that this works for everybody. So there's different types of technologies where having like a more diverse understanding of your audience is going to be like pretty crucial. Or even when it comes to things like I think there was an issue where early on when we had those huge steel cars, a lot of seatbelt manufacturers were only, or a lot of car manufacturers were only doing the safety tests on like men. And the way that seatbelts fit around women or children is going to be a lot different, and the optimal safety profiles of these things will change pretty dramatically based on like the type of model that you use in a car accident. That's like an example of, not everything.
So with the soap dispensers, for example, I was just looking into it, and they operate off of light bouncing back off the skin. So obviously darker skin, darker shirts, whatever it might be, tends to absorb light. Now people are suggesting,
but again, this is like an
solution to this,
right?
Could be, increasing the sensor equivalent, increasing the exposure to try to detect more. But, there are literal technological barriers that, once again, this is when we talk about racism of the gaps. Ooh, it could be because we didn't have enough black people on the team. That was the implication that was being put forward.
So real quick, this is an epistemic problem of like, how do we approach like what we ought to do? Or these are like more broader questions. The idea that it's a technological problem is not true. If I have a room full of white people and we are running across like like a black background, and I say like, hey, like what technology should we employ to be able to take a picture every time somebody crosses black background? A room full of white people might say like, we can just like look for the difference in color. Easy, boom, and then it's solved. But if you have a few black people and they might like, wait a second, well, if we look for just a difference in color, this isn't going to work. We need to use like motion sensing technology. There are absolutely a wide variety of ways that we can detect somebody's hand underneath the sensor. It doesn't have to be with beams of light. It doesn't have to be difference of color. But if you've got a room full of people that aren't thinking of like other things, then it might be the case that like all of them settle on like, oh yeah, well, if it's white, it works.
What Lauren is saying is that there's like practical realities that are being considered racism. So you brought up cameras that don't, like certain apps don't capture black faces. Like if you've ever worked on a film, if you've ever not, like, those face swapping apps, if you've never worked on a film and had to light people who were not white or Asian or light skinned, you have to light them completely differently. Like it's because their skin reflects or doesn't reflect light differently. Like this is like a well-known thing in the industry. You have to like adapt to it. So if like your camera phone with your lighting in there isn't capturing what it needs to capture in order to, put the stupid dog thing on your head for Snapchat, like part of that is like, that's how, I don't know if this counts as physics, but that's how light like bounces off of people's skin. Like,
well, sure, but I think that's exactly his argument. The idea is, oh, go ahead.
So I'm just saying, just real quick, like there are ways to account for all of this. There are very, very, very complicated problems right now being worked on by the smartest people on the planet in areas of like rocketry or quantum physics or, and machine learning. It's not people that are taking pictures of things. These are not unsolvable problems that escape all.
But it's not. So it's not. I'm not saying it's an unsolvable problem. What I am saying is that in Hollywood, where they have all the money, all the budget, everything they need, they have to light black people differently, right? Because light reflects off of their skin differently. So if they're using Arri Alexa, it's a $75,000 camera with a $150,000 lens, and they still need a special lighting rig so that you could see their face. Like that's a problem. That's like something that is a result of the way that light reflects.
Yes.
So if you have an app that needs a lit up face in order to do your facial recognition, and you're in your home, like, the lighting sometimes won't contribute to doing that. Like,
right, so then it sounds like you're giving a really good argument
for non-black people.
Right, so it sounds like you're giving a real good argument for why like the inclusion of diversity when it comes to the designing and implementing of these products would probably be beneficial, because these are problems that might be missed in the absence of black people, as Destiny was giving with this photo example earlier.
You're missing.
No. I'm not missing it. Well, if you'll let me finish, then you'll see that I'm not. So what you'll discover is that even when it comes to like the testing of some of these different things, so maybe you have a person who happens to have the phone, and the people in the testing environment are white people. So for the movie thing, for the movie example you gave, maybe when it was that they were designing the system or designing whatever the product is, it would sound like if there were black people there who they also tested the product on, then they might come to a conclusion that this thing might not function the way it would if it was exclusively done for white people. A black person being there, especially if you're able to already concede that the other problem created is specifically related to the fact that black skin has more pigment, and so this is problematic. So then a black person in a testing environment might make you realize, maybe we should change the way this functions such that, or maybe we should change the design so that way this won't be a problem for a specific demographic in our group. But that doesn't mean it's racist.
Absurd.
Yeah,
this is just such an sorry, Sean, just 1 minute. This is such an absurd assertion that white people cannot consider these problems, that you have to, or like, for example, if someone was creating a product, that they would have to be a woman to consider how it would impact a woman. Or like that you would have, like that an Asian person can't sit in a lab and be like, how will this react to black skin? Like, of course, other groups of people can think about those questions. You don't have to be black to consider how is this going to affect black people? How is this going to respond to black skin? Like maybe we could talk about encouraging in work environments, no matter the race of the people working in it, saying, okay, we need to talk about how this is going to affect all different sorts of people, because that will create a better product that will work more globally and that will earn us more money. So I don't doubt they already do consider these things. But the assertion that, you know, you have to have someone of a certain ethnicity in there to consider how it's going to react to their skin color, like that, I don't know, that's just absurd to me.
No one said have to. No one said it's forced. No one said this is a requirement. What has been suggested this entire time is that the inclusion of other groups can sometimes broaden the perspective such that these things can change. It's not about having to or forced to. It's not ever making the claim that no one can ever do this from another group. That's crazy. But I don't know how we got on this, and we were supposed to be originally talking about the effects of redlining, but it's a successful derailing.
It's an important thing.
The reason that I'm saying you're missing the point is that the app doesn't work without certain lighting conditions, right? Black faces are more vulnerable to those lighting conditions. Can you design the app better that it can compensate for some of those issues? Sure. But the lighting is external to the phone. So you can design the phone all you want, but the fact is, unless you light properly, which is different, which is external from the phone, you're going to get worse results on average. So having a black person in the phone when they do the testing in their lighting conditions, like, sure, you could have a model, it will do something, but if it doesn't work when lighting isn't sufficient, and statistically you need more lights for black people, you're going to have a disparity in when the dog face appears on their face in Snapchat, because that's what we're literally talking about.
This is everything you're saying is true. It's just sometimes people overlook these things. They don't have firsthand experience with it, and sometimes, unfortunately, the only firsthand experience you have to have is like experiencing yourself. So, like what Lauren says is correct. Like if you are if you are a worldly person and you can consider a lot of perspectives, then you won't miss these things sometimes. But like Sean, if you have like a group of like high school or college kids that have filmed like a ton of things and they're all white and they want to do another project and they make like a new black friend, they might not know what you know about lighting that subject appropriately. They might just shoot it and wonder why like all of their shots are either completely overexposed or washed out, or why he's not showing up on any of the shots. They might have no fucking idea what's going on just because they don't have that experience. That's all we're saying. I don't think we're saying that like everything has to be 33% race, 32% this, 50% male, 50%. It's just that sometimes having the other perspectives around can help you from like not missing dumb stuff. Another really good example is in like I think it was Fanatiq that brought it up, like computer database sets or whatever. Like when you're entering names, like depending on your origin or your background, you might not consider that some people have hyphenated names, or that some people have names with weird accents over them, or like dumb shit like that is possible to miss if you're not really thinking about it.
I don't think that has anything to do, like I agree with everything you just said, but I don't think that has anything to do with systemic racism. Like I can barely even pronounce Slavic names sometimes. Like this is just sometimes general societal, challenges that all of us face. Like you just said, a film crew not understanding the film dynamics that Sean does in a high school classroom. I don't think that has anything to do with systemic racism. And I'm not saying you're saying that, but this goes back to even the original point with the technology not detecting black hands. Like, does that have anything to do with actual systemic racism? Or is this just a little hurdle that we're trying to get over and there's different ways to approach it? And I don't think the necessary answer to that is we need to hire less white people. That's the broader conversation.
But I think even just on that thing, like these like little, I hate that we use the word racism for everything, because systemic racism doesn't have to be like resulting in the death of everybody. I think that like systemic forms of oppression can be like really small or dumb things. It might even be something as dumb as like the preference and temperature differences that men or women have, like in office spaces, where if you have like a ton of different men and you've got like a few women, that like it's always going to be kept at a temperature that is like ungodly cold for women. Or imagine, God forbid, if showers only had like one fucking temperature setting and women ran the shower industry. No man would be able to take a shower because women shower at an ungodly molten lava fucking hot temperature. You'd be fucked if you were a guy, right? So like, and again, it's not that like these forms of systemic oppression are leading to everybody being killed and murdered and blah blah blah, but it's just like little shitty things you have to deal with in life, and sometimes these things can ramp up, and a lot of these things can be accounted for like starting at the fundamental area of like, well, do we have like enough representation in this area for people to know?
I don't know, man. It seems really problematic. Like I can't get back to the redlining thing. I even DM'd him like, hey, can we talk about the redlining? And it's
a lot
just
of these
not going to happen.
things solve themselves just based on. Some of them do have to have a deeper.
Look how long we're already stuck on this straw man that had nothing to do with the original thing about systemic oppression. I don't think this is systemically oppressive. This is crazy.
People realize, oh my goodness, we have left 50% of the population, 50% potential buyers out of this product we're selling. Let's try to improve it so that we can include those people. We've left this entire community out. Like look at, for example, it's like when Black Panther came out, they were like, we've actually left this whole community out of this Marvel universe, having like a Black hero that could represent them. Let's make Black Panther, and then we'll invite an entire group of people into this Marvel universe. Like these problems tend to fix themselves in the sense of we actually, within capitalism in general, we want more people to be included in a product consumption. And certainly within government, they want all groups included, whether it be for voting purposes or whatever.
Okay, so can we get back to the redlining thing that we had been talking about, because it feels like we've kind of derailed really heavily, right? So Sean, you were talking about the redlining and like the fact that the law was made illegal in 1968. I think that's fine and that's fair, and it sounds like that should have been a step in the right direction. And yeah, there was some integration, and so some people were able to have access to like better things. I was one of those people that moved in, to a freaking white neighborhood where I was pretty much one of the very few, less than 5% of the black population in this, population was black in this region, and went to like basically all white school and an all white neighborhood and so on and so forth. So like, yeah, there's all these benefits that happen to individuals, but at the same time, while all these benefits were happening, then the government, this is what I was talking about earlier, what I wanted to get into, we got sidetracked so much from. After they passed the 1968 Fair Housing Act, then later on they needed to go down and pass the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, right, in 1975. So this is 7 years after redlining, in which they're now like recognizing like, we need to actually start collecting data. Same thing they did with North Carolina when it came to the traffic stops. We need to start collecting data on these lending practices, because they're starting to discover like that, that there seems to be some disparities in the way that these things were distributed, right? Has anyone in this call heard of reverse redlining?
No.
Reverse redlining? What is that? The Dodd-Frank Act?
No, reverse redlining.
Oh no, not Dodd-Frank. The other one. I'm thinking of the Community Reinvestment Act.
No, reverse redlining is the practice. You guys probably know it in practice, but maybe just not by name. So reverse redlining is the thing that happens when an institution goes and starts aggressively targeting specific loans towards people in a black neighborhood or in minority neighborhoods that are really problematic, these troubled loans, right? And so as opposed to redlining, which denied them any sort of loan whatsoever.
Problematic how?
Problematic in that they had disparate, they had higher interest rates. Some of them had adjustable rates. They were subprime loans, and these loans ended up disproportionately negatively impacting African Americans, such that a lot of their houses ended up foreclosing. That's what happened in 2006, 2009. So I would say first we had that act in 1975. Then afterwards, we ended up creating the Financial Institution Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act in 1989. So this is 14 years after that, which required them to collect and disclose data about applicant and borrower characteristics to assist in identifying possible discriminatory lending patterns and enforcing anti-discrimination statuses. So even though this is, now mind you, this is 1989. So we passed a law in 1968 specifically at making there be fair housing. And now that we're starting to give loans to these people, we're finding that there's another discriminatory practice even within the same thing. And that's 21 years later that we're passing this. All this is doing is collecting data. Now that they collected the data in 2006 and 2009 and so on and so forth, now you've had all of these various lawsuits against all of these banking institutions specifically for their discriminatory practices in their lending, right? So then even though we might have passed the Fair Housing Act, that didn't mean that that solved the problem of housing. This is a continual problem that's ongoing. So even though like we might have fixed that the redlining, there's still systemic oppression within the housing market. Would you say that that's fair to say?
No, because what ended up happening was they collected this data, they ended up finding a disparity, and I've seen multiple of these studies that can peg the disparity down to black people having worse credit scores on average. So, of course, they were going to get higher interest rates for the loans. And in 2003, when Barney Frank wanted to solve this problem, like they ended up incentivizing financial institutions to lend money to these minority people to correct for this historic discrimination. And it turns out credit scores weren't things that were just made up by banks to discriminate against these people. It actually evaluated their ability to pay back loans. So they ended up worse off due to the policy trying to correct this rather than the policy initially that was intended to harm them.
Absolutely not. So basically, it's not about whether or not people had credit scores. They found that even people with similar credit scores, they were still getting targeted with these disproportionately poor loans. Actually, Wells Fargo in 2012 would end up paying a $175 million settlement over charging Black and Hispanics higher rates and fees on mortgages, even when they qualified for better deals during the housing boom. And then several lawsuits went against all of the largest banks in our country, and it wasn't because specifically they were, it just so happened that they didn't have credit. It was they were directly targeting these loans towards Blacks and Hispanics. And I want to point out that they did control for both income of the individuals and credit scores of the individuals. And despite controlling for those two things, they still found that the banks were willing to give these Black people worse loans.
So I've seen this over and over again where like they'll control for credit score, but they won't control for income. They'll control for credit score and income, but then they won't control for down payment. Like this is what always happens. Like if you look at the numbers, Black people statistically have way lower credit scores than white people. It's something like 54% of them have a score below 640.
But if we're controlling for that, then that doesn't matter.
41% of them.
If we're controlling for that, it doesn't matter though. Why would you include that if we've already said we controlled for credit scores? We controlled for credit scores. Because one, I don't believe what you're citing because I've seen this over and over again that they don't typically control for all three. They conveniently there were literal lawsuits. They settled.
Wait, hold on, wait. Real quick.
First of all, a settlement doesn't mean anything, and $175 million is way less than the cost of litigation. Sears very famously fought a sex discrimination case for 10 years. They ultimately ended up winning that case, but it cost them well more than they would have actually ended up paying in gender discrimination. So the fact that litigation has risen the cost so much that it's cheaper to settle does not mean anything to me.
Does anybody have a link to this exactly? And I can just read it. We can find out what they control for.
Oh, sure. Here we go. I guess, let me see. I'll link it to you. Give me a second. First off, I want to say that there have been lawsuits across all of these institutions. Some of them were significantly more than $100 and something million, and even that to downplay like hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements towards these home mortgages sounds absolutely insane to me. And I think it points out, by the way, that this thing did happen in a large scale. In some cases, they literally were trying to find restitution for 50,000 Black individuals in a single case. I think this one was in New York. These things have continued to happen. We even had one basically in 2017 where someone just recently settled a lawsuit in there. These people have been sued by various other states and other like cities. So like the idea is that this was a widespread problem. They did control for both income and in credit scores. So I don't know why we had to go down that road about them having 50% less credit scores. And I guess we'll have to try to see if they actually control.
Did the settlement admit fault?
So
real quick. So the DOJ, when they filed this is on the DOJ website. Like it's justice.gov. So they say that these were similarly qualified borrowers. Now, maybe they are full of shit, or maybe they didn't like say anything, but like it says here, so like the settlement provides $184.3 million in compensation for wholesale borrowers who were steered into subprime mortgages or who paid higher fees and rates than white borrowers because of their race or national origin. And then it says later on that they will compensate African American and Hispanic retail borrowers who were placed into subprime loans when similarly qualified white retail borrowers received prime loans. Now, maybe Wells Fargo sucked at arguing the case, or maybe they thought that.
Well, you said retail borrowers. Like, can I get a specific definition on that? Is that people that they're trying to flip the houses?
My understanding is that like a retail customer is going to be juxtaposed to like what the fuck
like an
is the word?
investor,
like a business? No, like a business, like a commercial is what I'm thinking of.
Right. Okay.
Right? So like a retail customer is probably somebody that's shopping for like a home, like a general mortgage or an FHA loan or something for like a house that's like a personal residence. Whereas a commercial customer is going to be getting rental property or like a commercial property.
Well, I know for a fact that during the housing crisis, they would direct people to subprime loans because they were like, oh, look at this market, it's going to go up, and in 3 years you're going to sell it before the interest rate kicked in, which was all fine and dandy until you had the housing market crash. And as for the giant lawsuit,
wait, why didn't they do that to white people?
As for the giant lawsuit in the city of New York, my aunt was a part of that. So you could say 50,000 people against Citigroup, which was the New York one. Like, they sent her a thing in the mail and she signed it, and then she got like a couple $100 like after they got the settlement. Like, class action lawsuits are a giant scam for lawyers. They're the ones who make the most amount of money, and part of the strategy in a class action lawsuit is to expand the class to as large as possible so you can get a bigger settlement.
Well, wait, but that's also that's like an alignment of incentives though, right? Wouldn't you want, if there was a class action lawsuit being filed, wouldn't you want them to be incentivized to expand it to include every affected person? Isn't that the whole point of a class action lawsuit? Like,
but you expand it to everybody that you could possibly argue is affected.
Yeah, but it sounds like if your aunt got a check in her hand for a few $100s, then they must have made a compelling argument in front of a jury or a judge or a grand jury that she was affected. No, like it sounds like the process works as it should have, right?
What's a few $100s on a mortgage for a home for alleged discrimination against her for being Hispanic? Like,
it's great. So it sounds like
I mean, it depends. Well, wait, hold on.
Like, I'm saying she got a piece of the city settlement.
First of all, yeah, we don't know. I don't know about that specific one, but we don't know what the specific settlements were necessarily for anybody. Like, it might be that some people got like a couple $1,000s, or it might be that some people just got a couple $100. Like, maybe you're on a special case. Like, different people will probably qualify for different amounts based on what their circumstances were.
I'm just pointing out what a class action lawsuit does. I'm also pointing out that when you're sued for discrimination, or there's a complaint against a company for discrimination, first of all, you don't actually need a complainant for the Justice Department to investigate you. They could just investigate you based on disparate outcomes. It's on you to prove that you did not discriminate.
No, that's not the way the legal system works. It's on the Justice Department's job.
Wait, hold on.
Come on, this is crazy. It's the Justice Department's job to prove that there was something criminal being done. It's the Justice. I'm sorry, even civil. They have to prove that a discrimination was actually happening. They can't just say, "Well, here's a disparity, therefore wrongdoing." They have to prove they don't.
Nothing about these laws.
Wait, hold on.
Give me a single example.
Wait. I need to hear one case. So you're telling me your claim is that the DOJ, just like the DOJ, can go to a business and say, "Hey, you hired 40% white people and 60% black people. This is a disparate outcome. You need to prove that you weren't racist." I don't even know how that process works. Otherwise, okay, I never do this. Yeah, I never do this in debates. I swear to God. But can you think of just like one example? I'm not trying to like source you, but like, where has that actually happened before? Where the DOJ was like, "You're being racist." Oh fuck, we can't prove we're not being racist. And
you can look up any disparate outcome case, and you'll find examples of this. The onus is on them. Sears was a big case. They were comparing the way that women were being paid at Sears to a disparate outcome. Sears fought it for 10 years, and then they ultimately ended up winning. And I don't believe there was an actual complainant in the Sears case other than the federal government.
Well, I'm not talking about if an actual party as part of the company has complained. I'm saying that like
I'm saying I don't believe there was an actual person who complained to get the investigation into Sears.
What I'm asking is like, did Sears have to? So they lost just because they couldn't prove?
No. Sears won, but they proved that they weren't discriminating.
Okay, but did they have proof that they were, or did they have a compelling reason to believe that they were?
The assertion was that the women at this company make this, and they hold these positions. The men make this. It was a sex discrimination case. It went on for a decade, and the Department of Justice put that on them. And in the discrimination system, you have to prove that you did not do wrong, because it's regulatory law. It's not in our regular court system. That's why these companies always settle, or almost always settle.
But first off, I'm just going to reject that. I don't think that these companies always settle when it comes to discrimination lawsuits. I think that's absolutely absurd. Literally, you said you literally just gave the example of Sears obviously beating it. Secondly, obviously, it's crazy because you're bringing up all these confines for something that you've literally never encountered in your entire life. Yet somehow, even though I'm providing you something that you've literally never heard of, you automatically have this contention, basically voicing that there must be some control that they didn't control for, which is really crazy to me because it really does sound to me like what you're basically it really does sound to me like basically what you're doing is having encountered nothing. Having encountered nothing, you're literally just bringing up like objections about something that you literally know nothing about. Like, it's crazy to me that you would keep doing this. Generate what clip?
That assertion that he's making about settling, I'm just looking it up, and it looks like there's a heap of research showing that settling is generally better for large corporations than going to trial.
Oh, I totally agree with you.
Hold on, wait, hold on. Also, to be clear for that, okay? And I don't know the answer to this. I'm just saying that doesn't necessarily prove anything, because it might be the case that the only time the DOJ or whoever is responsible for pursuing these like Civil Rights Act violations, it might be the case that when they pursue those, more often than not, they have like a huge amount of evidence, so you do end up settling. Now, I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm just saying that just because people settle doesn't mean that like, oh, they would have won if they would have taken it to court. It might be the case that the majority settle because they know they're probably fucked and it's not worth it for the litigation to happen on either side.
Sure, and there's probably plenty of times where the Department of Justice decides to investigate somebody and then not even actually go to a lawsuit because they didn't find any wrongdoing. It's almost like you're making the implication that no matter what, whenever the Department of Justice looks, they're always going to find something criminal, which is or civilly wrong.
If you're going based on disparate outcome, then yeah, you're always going to find disparate outcome because people behave differently. And of course, we're not going to expect equal representation across all industries. It would be absurd to do that. It's the denial of cause and effect. If you act differently and expect the same outcome, then like that's ridiculous.
But that's the problem, is most of the time we're not talking about just the outcomes. What we're talking about are opportunities. You see, when it comes to something like mortgage rates, right? When we have all of these different banking institutions, the largest, right? Wells Fargo settlement, $475 million. They're literally the largest loan holder in the country as of 2019. They were. So it's like a mortgage loan carrier in the country, it seemed like. So then when they're settling a lawsuit, like basically saying, yes, we were doing something systemically racist, it seems like
fault in the lawsuit. I doubt.
Yeah, that was the question.
I don't know whether or not they admitted fault, but
that's really important.
I guess so, but then the argument comes now that you can just dismiss any time a person settles because you can say that they didn't admit fault. But you just hold on, let me finish. But you just admitted already in this conversation that it is beneficial for these people in these circumstances to settle. So you can't go and say, well, it's beneficial for them to settle, so that makes all the sense in the world, and then say, well, the fact that they settled means that they didn't admit guilt, so then therefore at this point we can't prove anything. You're literally trying to have your cake and eat it too in that situation.
No. When you
understand the legal system here.
When you start characterizing what Wells Fargo said, that's when I asked you if they admitted fault, because you.
When did I characterize what they said?
That they did.
I never characterized anything they
said. Go back and watch the tape.
Wait, I just to ask. So like, if Wells Fargo has through this settlement identified victims of being pushed into subprime mortgages that shouldn't have been otherwise, is that considered a form of admitting fault, or is that just them kind of like memeing? Or I don't understand what that means.
I'm talking about when you have a settlement, you can either admit fault in a settlement or not admit fault in a settlement.
So are you saying it's possible that Wells Fargo didn't admit fault but was still able to accurately identify supposed victims of this class action suit and then pay them out?
Yeah, so Fred Wilpon, the former owner of the Mets. Fred Wilpon, the former owner of the Mets, it was alleged by a prosecutor that he knew about Bernie Madoff's scam, right? And they wanted $1 billion from him. Fred Wilpon ended up paying $143 million, and and he admitted no fault. So there was no criminal allegations, and the Department of Justice acknowledged, at least based on the terms of the settlement, that he did not know about the Bernie Madoff scam, but he did profit from it. So that would be a no-fault settlement. That happens all the time. Like Kobe Bryant paid that woman the one.
Sure. Wait, hold on. But there's a difference.
Wait, guys, this is important. As part of the settlement agreement, Wells Fargo did not admit liability. In a statement, the bank said it strongly disputes the allegations made by the city in the lawsuit over Fair Housing Act claims.
Sure, but then despite doing that, they were somehow able to then find specific victims and then give money directly in an actual settlement. Because part of the settlement might have been.
Do you not understand how?
Hold on. Part of the settlement might have been a broader thing in which they had to do some form of systemic changes, but then they also had to find individual actors and then pay them individual restitution. How did they figure which people were getting the restitution?
And then also, wait, I'm just like super curious. If you're doing a settlement, why would you ever admit fault? I'm genuinely asking, because like if you're going to have to quote unquote admit fault, why wouldn't you just say fuck it, take me to court and sue me then? Fuck you. Like what's the difference? I don't understand why would you why would you ever admit fault as part of a settlement?
Well, if you're caught dead to rights and like the prosecutor knows that they can prove you guilty, like you can submit an offer that you admit no fault, but the prosecutor be like, no, I'm gonna get you either way. So like there are like typically this is like a plea bargain based on not great evidence. Like they don't want to drag it out. Yeah, obviously, ideally, you don't want to admit fault because that sets you up in a better position. You pay less on the settlement than you would pay your lawyers, and you don't admit any fault.
And like sometimes you'll offer things to get, like I just finished up a lawsuit myself in the state of California, and we just wanted to end the case, not because I didn't have a great argument. My lawyers were completely confident that we had a very solid argument. It worked in other cases in Germany before, but we settled simply because the costs were too high to go forward, or not settled rather, but we ended the case simply because the costs were too high to keep going forward. And we made an agreement with the other party. The other party, one of their offers was you have to agree you won't take this to higher courts, et cetera, et cetera. Otherwise, we're going to go after you for more money. And these are just all conversations that happen at the end of the lawsuit. The fact that they got the ability to say, actually, we did nothing wrong, we're just settling this to get this shit out of the way, is pretty impressive. I mean, it's not a small deal, because sometimes the other side will be like, actually, we are so confident in our case, we are going to keep going, we are going to make you admit fault because we know for sure we're going to win this, and we're not going to just let it go and settle. But so this is a big deal.
Couldn't it also be the case that like the more important part of this, especially since so are these civil proceedings, or were there ever like criminal charges on them?
It was always civil.
Because if it's all just civil, wouldn't it make sense for the DOJ, if they want to settle, just say settle it to get people their money faster, even if they knew that they had like 100% like we're going to win the case? Like I could be wrong, but I doubt Wells Fargo is hurting for money to fight cases in court. It feels like they could fight.
It is more expensive to fight cases sometimes.
Yeah, it's significantly more expensive.
Significantly.
Sure,
people like hold on. For people like us, yes, okay, but I'm pretty sure Wells Fargo has a whole
That's not true, because they have to pay a higher amount than the people
I'm sure that they do, but you have to understand that what you guys are saying, okay, and I don't think either of you wants to bite the bullet on this. The precedent you're saying is that every single person that settles is like always like guilty or always not guilty. I don't think that it's
no,
fair
we're not
to, like,
saying that. We're talking about an individual case, and we're talking about a case in which they said they're not guilty and they do not accept liability. Yeah. There are cases where settlements happen where they do say they are guilty.
Wait, in the vast majority of civil cases, they don't actually admit that they're guilty. That's not normally typically part of a settlement. Even like you cited the Kobe Bryant case. He didn't say that he was guilty when he settled that case. And I understand there are plenty of situations where obviously corporations settle because they don't want to go through the lawsuit. Freaking Magic Mountain did that when some kid hopped two huge fences and got decapitated by the Batman ride, and they ended up paying him out even though they did everything reasonable. They would have won that lawsuit over if they had actually went to it, but they didn't want to deal with the publicity. I understand that, but there's a difference here. It'd be one thing if it was like just a no-fault settlement. It's a no-fault settlement with to the tune of $175 million. So I think that it starts becoming a little bit more real here. Then of course, then you have the other one for just the Manhattan portion of JP Morgan, where they end up suing someone for $53 million, right? And so you have all of these lawsuits all across all of our largest banks, and all of them end up settling for large amounts of money, in which the Department of Justice is claiming these things. So I don't know. It just seems really weird to me that I guess you have to assume that it really seems to me well, I guess so. You're right. 175 million is not that much, but I guess it really seems to me that I guess then I guess you have to make the assumption then that I guess some kind of way the Department of Justice is just intentionally going and making lawsuits against things that are not necessarily problematic, because the Department of Justice is not as smart as you, and so they can't see that because of these disparate policies, that some kind of way that it really was just a matter of personal choice and it had nothing to do with policy, and they decided to sue anyway because they were nefarious, and you know better than them. I guess that's what we have to go with.
It's I know better than you. It's a matter of policy that you can look at disparate outcome to determine if there was discrimination. The Supreme Court has ruled that you can look at disparate outcome to determine discrimination.
Where do they rule that? Show me. Link
when
me.
They're
Where?
suing
Where?
based on
Link
disparate outcome.
Link me that.
When they're suing based on disparate outcome, then sure, that's the results that you're going to get. And we've seen changes in our laws that you could use disparate outcome as a standard.
Show me.
Changes in our regulatory structure.
What law?
During the
What law?
Obama administration.
What law? I need a law. I need a law. Show me.
During the Obama administration, the head of Housing and Urban Development changed the criteria for the Fair Housing Act to include disparate outcomes regardless of whether or not there are non-racial based explanations.
Can you show me a link to that?
Look it up for yourself.
Can you link it to me? You're making a claim. I need you to link that to me, please. This second thing I'm asking for that I'm not getting.
Oh, you mean the first thing that I sent in the chat? That's right there? Oh, okay. Everybody got quiet.
I think what we should do is we would probably all need to go through the actual case details here and read it to have an honest conversation about this specific case, right? And we would have to understand what they defined as discrimination, because I'm willing to accept if we both read through the case, maybe it was the case that brokers were literally like, that sounds like a black person, no way but I do have my doubts that was the case. I think that there are other factors that could be involved, like this is a poorer neighborhood. This is the kind of job they have. I am willing to accept also that potentially there were a dozen other factors involved here that just happened to lean against minorities applying, right? And we would all have to sit here and properly go through the case instead of sitting here and making definitive statements that yes, 100% it was racism, no, 100% it was racism, because absolutely it is a coin toss right now without reading it that.
Well, if this was a settled case, are any of these documents even public? Are we ever going to know that? Is that even?
The initial complaint would be.
So maybe we should move on to something else, because really it's up in the air. They haven't taken liability. It is completely possible they just shrugged their shoulders and were like, hey, it's way easier to pay this amount than go and pay all of the crazy court costs. It's possible they're like, hey, we're going to get screwed here. Let's just try to settle quickly. We can't know that. We know they didn't admit fault. We know that they did settle. So it's almost like there's a bit on both sides, but none of us have actually gone through and read through all the court documents.
Just to be clear, yeah, I agree that none of us have gone through. None of us also have any ability to say that, they settled because the lawyers would have cost more than $200 million. We have no idea about that either.
That's exactly what I'm saying, though. That's what I'm saying.
But you're heavily leaning on one side. We're like, well, maybe it was just too expensive, and they probably just wanted to pay because LOL. They admitted no fault.
No.
It's not a maybe. To battle the Department of Justice is a hugely costly endeavor. I just told you about the Sears case that lasted over a decade, and they ended up losing more than various settlement offers.
It's terrible
how much
PR
did
too,
how much did they cost to settle the Sears case or to fight the Sears case?
Oh, it's from 1980s, so you have to convert the currency.
Okay, sure. I'm just saying that if we want to talk about the Wells Fargo thing, it seems like none of us know exactly, right, what it cost or what it could have cost. Wells Fargo did admit fault. That's true. The DOJ said that they found at least, I think it was 4,000 cases where minority borrowers were steered into subprime mortgages, right? Well, we don't know 100%. I think we can leave it there, but I'm not comfortable being like, well, maybe they just settled because LOL, they don't want to, right? We just said none of us know exactly 100%.
If this is also what I mean, I'm willing to accept that in America today, there is racism and discrimination that exists. I personally think it's against lots of people everywhere. I think every group has their prejudices. But this is what when I opened with saying there is a highly exaggerated level of discrimination in the States that tends to benefit a lot of activist groups. It would, to me, if it were to the degree that a lot of activist groups, and I'm not saying necessarily you guys agree with this, but so many people will say we live in a white supremacist nation. We live in a nation that is deliberately like trying to put down blacks at every, angle in education, law, business. When the examples people come up with are these highly contentious cases, or even you look at BLM's cases where their heroes they have to pick are like Jacob Blake, who has just an insane track record of stalking and, pulling out a knife. Like, if it were to the degree that a lot of activists portray it as, we would not be having so much contention over these cases. It would be like, damn, wow, that guy was literally on his hands and knees begging, do not shoot me, and just got shot point blank by the police. This is a 100% cut and dry discrimination case. Like, the thing is, there's so many contentious cases here that could be argued either way, that could go either way, that I really don't think it's as simple as saying 100% the US is white supremacist, racially discriminating, systemic oppression nation. Like, I feel like that is, that there has to be a lot of reaching that goes into that.
For sure,
but I'm talking about right now.
Yeah, but I don't here's the deal. I never ever like having to try to argue for other people making ridiculous claims. Sure, I don't think anyone here is talking about this as a 100% racist nation that's just intentionally bringing down all black people. I don't think that's my argument. I'm pretty sure Destiny wouldn't argue that, and I know you two wouldn't. So the idea is not necessarily about that, but what we can say is that there is the existence now of systemic oppression that does disproportionately impact the lives of African Americans today, right? And that's a thing. I want to point out really quickly that the settlement with Bank of America was much more than the $53 million, or whatever. That was for $335 million. And then they ended up having that was a portion of the settlement that was a $16.6 billion lawsuit that they ended up settling with the Department of Justice.
So wait, they settled on millions when it was $16.6 billion?
No, they settled
the initial complaint?
No, I'm sorry. Maybe you weren't hearing. I'll say it one more time. That specific portion that they were settling on was for $335 million. But the overall thing was $16.6 billion. That was what for their financial practices of that $16.6 billion, a portion of it.
They had to pay $16.6 billion. That's what you're asserting?
That's what I am asserting, yes. Yeah.
I mean, I sincerely doubt that, but
okay,
I think the lawsuit initially would have been for that amount.
Here, I can just read this. I'm just going to read this really quick. Bank of America. Let me just read it really quick.
Just link it.
Okay.
Just link it.
Yeah, I'm going to link it to him. But
that sounds odd. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying you're a liar, but that sounds odd.
Oh, okay. You said you doubted, but I got you here. I don't even have
I doubt it.
Let me ask, if someone wins a lawsuit that they were discriminated against for being Christian by a single organization in the States, does that prove systemic discrimination against Christians in the US?
I don't think a single lawsuit should prove anything. I think that these have to be done. I think that it can't really be looked at legally. It has to be looked at academically. You have to gather a whole bunch of different cases. It might be the case that you can find one bad case of a Christian or a black person or a Chinese person or a white person being violently assaulted every single day for every single year, 365, and that still might not be systemic because there's a lot of people that live in the United States. There's over 350 million people here. So I mean, it has to be done on a study basis, not on a case study basis, not on this one thing happened or these two lawsuits happened or these two things happened. Yeah.
Well, this is what I'm almost getting at.
This is a payment for financial fraud. The overall lawsuit is $16.65 billion for financial fraud. And then you're saying 330 million of that 16.65 billion is due to racial issues.
Sure, it was the 335 million. I can link you that portion. So that's the overall fraud that they got caught with, and then the other portion. Hold on. I
thought you were saying this was a $16.65 billion discrimination lawsuit. That's
nope.
Not the case.
I definitely said better. I guess you weren't listening the second time when I repeated it, and that's why I was going to read it really quick. But yes, it was just for the $16.65 billion was just for the financial crisis and for just fraud that they committed of that 16.65 billion. 335 million of it went towards their discrimination, the civil portion, or for their civil discrimination. That was that portion. So they were two different things. The investigation went into this time period. If you notice, for most of these civil lawsuits, it's for the borrowing that happened specifically during 2006 to 2009, because that's what the Department of Justice was investigating primarily. They were trying to figure out what exactly contributed towards the financial crisis supremacists. And so then during that time, these things were all tangentially related, right? Obviously, doing all those subprime loans, like that had a big impact on obviously the foreclosure rate, so on and so forth. And so then that's what they were investigating. And upon investigating that is where they discovered that there was this disparity that was happening, and not just a disparity of intention.
Great, Sean, I'll let you read through that quickly because I did want to clarify something from my last point. Someone in my chat was saying that I was straw manning you guys, and I'm not trying to do that. I was just trying to assess what I typically hear as systemic oppression, and I typically hear the statement of, you know, America's white supremacist nation. So I actually want to clarify with you guys, because even I wouldn't deny, of course, that racism within individual institutions potentially, even like sexism and rape culture within certain institutions exists in areas, right? But when we talk about the idea of the broader nation of America being institutionally racist or white supremacist, I want to gauge where your guys' stance is on that. Like, do you think that America is a white supremacist nation? Do you think the whole nation in itself is systemically against Black people? I'll let you guys answer that. I want to like actually get a gauge of your stance.
I don't know, what that sounds kind of weird. I wouldn't say the whole nation. I mean, obviously a big portion of the nation is Black people, right? Like 13% of it. So then clearly that portion wouldn't be white supremacists for the majority of that portion.
But
right?
Is the rest the non?
No, I would not assume that the rest of the country is white supremacists. That's a really weird framing. I don't think anyone really argues that way. That sounds crazy.
I think I've heard these statements before. I think that the problem comes with the words we use. This is why I said I don't even like the term systemic oppression or systemic racism, because even people on the left and right don't know what it means anymore. Like, I think that when people hear that enough, I think that you can make arguments traditionally that systemic oppression does still exist in the United States. It is in a lot of every single person, or even the majority of people, or even like a minority of people are racist. It might be a very, very slim majority, or a very, very slim minority, or it might just be like shitty outcomes that are that our systems like unintentionally perpetuate that kind of keep people fucked. For instance, throwing young fathers into jail for some stupid shit like marijuana, and then having their kids grow up to be fucking criminals because that's what you do when you don't have fucking parents in the household. But I think people get really fixated on the outcome sometimes, and they're just quick to say that like everybody's racist and everybody's white supremacist, which is a really stupid thing to do. I think everybody here agrees that.
Actually, I'm way more open to the idea of accepting like there are stupid systems that have been put in place that are unintentionally fucking up people's lives, and in some cases it's certain ethnic groups. You know, like the war on drugs has absolutely had horrible outcomes for, as you said, causing fatherlessness in certain communities for small crimes. So I am way more sympathetic and willing to accept the idea that there are bad policies that are unintentionally fucking up certain groups' lives than the idea that there is this deliberate, concerted effort for white people to put down Black people in America.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
So I think this is what intelligent people, which there are unfortunately very fucking few left of, will argue when it comes to shitty laws and like kind of like racist outcomes. A really, really good example of this that I hope we all agree with is fucking marijuana laws. Now, we can all agree that there's probably some level of policing that's going to be higher in Black neighborhoods than white neighborhoods because there is a disproportionate level of crime. Even if it's too high, even if it's not the perfect representation, there is going to be more policing there. Just as a result of that, and just as a result of what might be a legitimate effort to police, certain groups of people more, because the marijuana laws are on the books, if you are a non-violent, non-offending Black person and you happen to get pulled over because you live in one of these neighborhoods and you have weed on you, now you might be fucked. And if it's like your second or third time getting caught with weed, now your life might be fucked. And so like those types of laws that are on the books just fuck everything over for everybody, especially certain groups of people, especially because of where groups of people tend to live. And I think that those are the types of things that people should really seek to like focus on and target to get rid of it, because they're the ones that are creating the really bad outcomes for no good reason.
For sure. And I would like to add, and I was going to say really quickly, like, because of the fact that we are in an integrated society, it's really hard to find something that specifically and only affects Black people, right? There are plenty of things that we always use the word disproportionate specifically for that reason, because if you do something that's specifically aimed at I don't know. It's really hard to find Black people exclusively and not also get Hispanics. It's really hard to target like any minority groups and not have some sort of overlap. We are a homogenous society. Segregation is not like, that's just not the policy here, right? So then at this point, it's really hard to distinguish those things. So because of that, most of the time when you're looking at systemic oppression, you're going to be looking for things that disproportionately target people or disproportionately harm people. It's not going to be about intentionality necessarily. And really quickly, I was going to say finally, I think it would really be helpful helpful in a lot of these discussions because people get so triggered by some of these words. If instead of saying the word systemically racist, because racist is incredibly loaded, we should probably say something more to the tune of systemically disproportionately, systemically damaging to African Americans, right? Systemically damaging to African Americans, or things like that. And I don't know how you would, or disadvantageous, that's even better. Systemically disadvantageous to African Americans. And there are plenty of systems that are in place right now that are disadvantageous towards African Americans in particular.
Okay, so this is something that someone pointed out in my chat as well, exactly the argument you're making. He's saying, wait, so if she's conceding that the war on drugs has resulted in racial disparities, she is conceding the argument that this is an example of systemic racism. Now, I think that point of, the disproportionate results in policies, that's not necessarily the case, because while certain things and policies may be made that affect certain groups more than others, that doesn't mean it was intentionally made to affect a certain group more than others. Murder laws, for example, made to stop people from murdering, killing other people, obviously disproportionately affect men. I do not think that is systemic discrimination against men just because men happen to commit more murder. The same case that I do not think that these laws were created specifically to imprison Black people more. I think that they tend to commit more drug crimes. Not that I necessarily support the drug laws in place, right? So I can disagree with the drug law in place while also holding the point that I don't think it was put in place intentionally to put more Black fathers in prison. And that's why I am more so willing to concede to Destiny's point of unintentionally fucking up people's lives, where
Sure.
I don't think these people are going in saying, yes, let's put Black fathers in jail with this. And if they are, then fuck them, obviously. Like, that's horrible, but I don't think that's the case.
Right, but that's
And
not.
I agree with this. I agree with this
Oh my
1,000,000%.
God.
I think that the best place to look at here, I think, would be something like the crime bill that everybody is like super critical of. When you go back in time and you look at the crime bill, well, there are some things about that crime bill that definitely weren't awesome. So, for instance, like 3 strike laws probably didn't do what we wanted them to do. There are parts of that crime bill, when people were pushing for it at the time, as much as we like to go back and call everybody racist that was pushing it, this was not done with racial intent. Now, some people will argue that some people pushing it might have been racist, but it was also supported by I think it was the Congressional Black Caucus. It was supported by Black members of the Senate. It was supported by the Black community.
Wait, but Destiny, that's not true. That's not true.
Okay. Wait, we'll do this later if we want. Okay. There are lots of people around the country that wanted to crack down on crime. If you go look at any crime chart in the entire fucking country, I think in the 90s when like homicides were spiking, it was like insane. Like the rates of violent crime at any other point in US history was like super fucked. But the outcomes, like downstream after implementing some of these laws, have like disproportionately targeted certain groups of people, which in and of itself might not be bad. But the problem is that disproportionate targeting ends up exacerbating other issues. And now you're getting like more and more fucked up down the road. So for instance, going back over and over again, and I'll hammer on this point every time because conservatives, I know they agree with me because everybody knows this. Families are incredibly fucking important. I know it every time a conservative sees 2 gay people, they scream about how important families are, okay? When you destroy families by throwing people that smoke weed into fucking jail, you are destroying the children and you're creating these environments where your neighborhoods are going to be fucked up. You're going to have more fatherless children. You're going to have more people in fucking prison. You're going to have more people selling and buying drugs. Like everything just gets so fucked up. And yeah, I think that a lot of our stuff, we can look at any institution. I focus on criminal justice because I know the most about it. But when our criminal justice system is like targeting a group of people more than others, and then that targeting is exacerbating all these other issues in society that's leading it to happen more and more, I think that's like a good argument for like a systemic form of, we can call it racism or oppression or something like that.
Hold on, really.
There's not.
Oh my God. Okay. I was going to say really quickly. I think that there's one more problem is that like even still, I guess it's really hard. It's really hard to argue from intentionality, right? So to say that some laws were designed specifically with the intention, even ones that look really egregiously so, it's going to be really hard to prove that. So that's why a lot of times it's better to, instead of talking about the intention of the individual, it's more to look at the outcome. I think there are times where we can look at something and say, given the knowledge that we have, we should be able to understand that there would likely be an outcome. We can look and say that they should have been aware of how this would impact different people. I think a good example of that is like if you restrict strict citizenship from a group of people, and then like 2010 you say, okay, great, you can be citizens, and in 2011 you make a law that says you can vote only if you've been a citizen for 5 years. It's like you should be able to tell that from doing this law, considering the previous law, that this will have this impact. And so maybe you can say, no, this is just on its face not racist. It's just a law that basically just says something about 5 years. It doesn't mention black people at all. Well, for the next 4 years, black people are going to have a terrible outcome there, right? And so in those cases, then you can start saying, well, even if maybe these people were just short-sighted and really didn't see what the outcome can be, you can still say that this is a likely outcome that was obviously something that we should have been able to recognize at this point, and it is greatly harming black people in this case. And I think you can find that with the drug crimes and so on and so forth. And I wanted to push back just quickly against Lauren Southern making a statement that black people just happen to do more drug crimes, and I don't think that that's true. In fact, I think to the contrary, I think they found that blacks make up 33% of all drug crimes, specifically for crack cocaine. Specific, I can find it. Let me find it. This is just off the top of my head because it's something I read a long time ago.
33% of drug crimes?
They made 33%. I'm sorry, that's 33%
higher than their population.
33% of all drug crimes, specifically. Well, sure, you know what, you might be right. So if you're just talking about more disproportionately, maybe they do. Yeah, in that case, I think they said. Or here's a better one: blacks and whites use marijuana at the same rates. That we know that. So blacks and whites use marijuana at the same rates, but blacks make up.
That's not true either.
But blacks make up 74%. I think they said, or something, of all marijuana prosecutions and arrests.
Is that from the ACLU?
I believe so.
Yeah, the ACLU study was based on self-reporting, and there's been significant studies on self-reporting within black and white communities. Unfortunately, and this is an unfortunate case, there is a lot of mistrust in studying data and particularly reporting drug use to police within the black community, and I completely understand that. So when it comes to self-reporting, typically, if they will test black communities and white communities to report what types of drugs they've used and then take a hair test after, they found that there's disproportionate outcomes, particularly amongst blacks, where they will say they haven't done a drug and then the hair test will say otherwise. So I can send you those studies in the chat if you'd like.
Yeah, please do.
Even if we grant that they use at very similar rates, statistically insignificant difference. The idea that just because you isolated this one crime out of all the crimes that blacks and whites do differently. And by the way, I'm not even going to entertain the fact that marijuana is the reason for mass incarceration. America's incarceration rate is due to its violent crime. So I'm just putting that out there. Dude, calm down with the straw man. I'm just setting this up that this isn't even a significant thing. So if you live in an area where there's higher rates of murder, higher rates of rape, higher rates of assault, higher rates of all these different violent crimes, and you have more officers sent to that area to deal with the higher rates of crime, and those officers happen to smell or see people smoking marijuana more, then obviously you're going to have disproportionate arrests. On top of that, those studies don't account for when people are arrested for other charges and they plead down to a possession charge. On top of that, the Manhattan Institute did a study on marijuana arrests in New York, and what they found out was that the biggest predictor of marijuana arrests by neighborhood was whether or not the neighbors were calling the police complaining about usage of marijuana outside. So it might be that blacks use marijuana at the same rates, but if they're smoking outside more, if there's other crimes and therefore more officers to see it, and if they're pleading down from drug trafficking charges, we would not be surprised by these numbers at all.
Really quickly, Lauren.
That might be true. Well, just as a real quick, because people bring this up a lot. So firstly, if we break down like why people are in prison, we say that like a lot of it has to do for state prisons for violent crime. That is true, but in a roundabout way, like a lot of this is probably related to drugs. Yeah.
I wouldn't say that.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say so. Like for state prisons, so like I see like 1.3 million people are locked up in state prisons, right? So of those 1.3 million, 713,000 are for violent crime, right? For rape and sexual assault, that's 165,000, right? For robbery, that's 169,000. For assault, it's 136,000. If I go up to like the drugs part, that's 191,000. I mean, like, I'm not saying that all violent crime is due to drugs, but I'm sure that like the drug issue exacerbates this a lot. I hate repeating this because I don't have a study offhand and I only heard a lawyer friend float this to me, but I've heard the idea given that one of the big reasons for drops in violent crime from the 90s to today, I don't know if you've heard of this, Sean, is the idea that we didn't actually do much in terms of how we changed policing and everything, but that a lot of kind of the drug gangs like sorted out their property more, so there's just not as much conflict with them actually shooting and killing each other, and that's one of the reasons why violent crime dropped as much as it did. But yeah, I think that I know that a lot of people are in jail for.
I've heard like aerosolized lead was like fully banned in trucks in like 1994. Like
Yeah, stuff like the lead around the country. Although I think that's been a little bit weakened. Although there were a lot of correlations found with that. The economists have studied that across tons of different countries. But I think that it's I'm just saying I don't think it's fair to say that like, oh no, well like most people are in jail just because of like violent crime. It's not related at all to drugs, when a lot of violent crime is related to drugs. And we know this because when we look at like mass shootings in the U.S., we always say we have like 400 a year. A lot of that is related to gang shit. A lot of gang shit is related to drug shit.
Really quickly, by the way, Lauren, your specific thing didn't really deal with like I don't feel like that was a direct contention to the original statement that I was making. This thing only tested 896 males, and it was specifically 896 males who were arrested, right? Like, and I think that there's a very big difference between testing like arrested people and whether or not they're willing to concede some sort of information, and the type of study on self-reporting in general, where there's like not the same risk or association with if I confess to this, then I will be labeled in a certain way, or maybe they might try to look for evidence for certain things, sure, and so on and so forth. These two things, you can't use this thing. You can't use this random study of arrested people of 900 males to try to undo a larger, broader study.
I've got another study that you can take a look at, and I do want to clarify. You did state marijuana, whereas these studies that I'm putting forward are just about drug use in general. So, for example, I've got one here. So underestimating cocaine use and overestimating marijuana use, even when other factors were controlled for, the self-report and the hair test results for African Americans were more discrepant than for non-African Americans. This shouldn't surprise anyone, really.
Is this for arrested people again?
Sorry?
Is this for arrested people again?
I'll check the study also.
Because again, if you're going to just be showing me studies of people who are arrested, I would imagine that most people, and when they're arrested, like for crimes, that they probably don't want to confess to other crimes or the presence of other opiates or other drugs in general. So I would imagine, yes, then you might get some disparities there.
But it still shows that a disparity, because you'd think
it shows a disparity of self-reporting. Sure, no, but you're
that either.
Sure, but well, I don't know. I think probably like attitudes for Black people towards prison and white people might be very, very different. But again, I think
that's in general.
Sure, exactly. So then I think the idea you can't just use that.
To be ultra clear on this, it might be the case that, so I'm looking at what was linked. So this is comparison of self-admitted drug use and urinalysis for opiates, sedatives, and stimulants in a population of 896 males arrested for felonies. I don't think it's fair to say that because there's a difference in groups in how people that are arrested for felonies have self-reported drug use, I don't think it's fair to take that and say that, oh, well, the whole population is probably the same. I think we would
Sure, that's fair. I'll quickly check this study, if the second study I have.
Didn't he literally just say what I just said?
Or not, since that's a fair point.
I will say that I've heard it's come up a million times in debates that people look at the discrepancy, and I think a lot of it goes back to the ACLU thing. People look at the discrepancy between self-reported usage of marijuana, which whites typically score a bit higher, and I think that is true that white people, I don't know if this Brookings study uses that same, I don't know if they use the same ACLU.
I believe they're slightly lower, but it's like 17.9 to like 8 to like 18.4. It's like something really close.
It's not massive. So this one, oh no, I'm sorry. This is, wait, I'm sorry, I can't read. This is too small. I'm booming. So this shows like, or no. This shows white as being slightly lower by, I think, a couple points.
That's what I meant.
Yeah. So people will bring up, but then people are very quick to bring up that, well, the disparate arrest rates they actually matched what the real usage rates is because Black people misreport self-usage. And I've heard that like given life a lot. Like I've heard people verbalize that, but I've never seen that like actually substantially.
That's why like my contention isn't with the survey data. It's with isolating this one factor and pretending that this is what's driving law enforcement. Like therefore this like one anomaly where Blacks and whites behave very similarly should be treated as like the peak evidence instead of all these disparities, which is what the police actually target and go after.
Well, Sean, no one did that. No one did that.
The gang explanation is interesting, but like we saw similar crime spikes in the UK and in Europe in the post-World War, or actually in the 60s. So like they didn't exactly have the same gang culture. Like there was crime rises around the country. Around the world. In Western nations.
I'm pretty sure in the UK they have like gang shit that goes on. Like even in Sweden, there's like gang. Like I think most countries have gang related stuff that happens. Maybe not to like the crazy extent that it happens in the US, but there's definitely like gang related shit that happens.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, but that's because of the exacerbation of poverty on those things.
Well, poverty doesn't drive crime. That's nonsense. Black crime was falling from the 1930s to the 1960s when they were way poorer than the post 60s.
Hold on, wait. Do you have a
saw the Great Recession where crime did not increase despite people predicting that?
Okay. Wait, do you have a study that shows? Because look, you can say that black people were poorer like from the 1930s than they were at this other time, and that's not what the argument would be. You need to show me that there wasn't, as from the 1930s to 1960s, a decline in criminality during that specific time that was like somewhat consistent with like the poverty rate. Like in order for you to be able to make these claiming these two different things, you can't just make a broad statement and say, well, black people were poorer during this time, and then but crime was worse in the 90s, right? Because there could be entirely different external factors that could be causing to that.
Why are you saying poverty is driving it?
Well, because poverty is an obvious linked driving factor for crime.
It's an obvious misdirect. Again, if blacks were poorer in the 50s than they were in the 70s, and their homicide rate in the 50s was going down, and in the 70s it was going up, why would we think poverty is driving it? There's no real correlation between the two.
Is it possible that there's a correlation between the two, but there was an external factor in the 70s that contributed to the rise in homicides aside from poverty? Because we're not making the statement that poverty is the only controlling or the only driving factor here. What we're making is that there is a link, that these two things you can see with even in white people, when you had more poverty and more poverty-stricken areas, that there's an increase in crime. Now, maybe not relative. I mean, maybe not the exact same as blacks, right? Because there are other external factors. But poverty, the link between poverty and crime has long been established by pretty much everyone. If you're literally trying to deny that basic fact, I just don't know where you're coming from.
I mean, crime can drive poverty. Like, people don't want to invest in neighborhoods with high crime. So, like, in that way, sure, like, crime is a driver of poverty. But again, like, we have never, like, there's no data that suggests that that poverty is predictive over time of crime. It's just not the case. Like, we've seen people's crime rates fall as their incomes are. We've seen people's crime rates fall as their incomes fall. We've seen people's crime rates go up as their general incomes go up. Like, this is undeniable.
Can you show me that? This is the third thing I'm asking you for. This is the third thing that I'm asking you for that you're literally not going to give me. I feel like every time I've asked you for something, you haven't provided it. But I've linked you the things that I've asked for.
First of all, I sent you what you asked for in the chat. I know that's a rhetorical advantage. The first thing you asked for was about black home ownership during redlining. I sent that in the message.
Okay, that's one. And then what about the other two things that I asked you for?
Second thing was that Julian Castro changed the rules around redlining, like around for housing to look at disparate outcomes.
Sure, Destiny linked that.
Looking for, but you were asking me questions while I was looking for it.
You're right. Destiny did link that second thing. I was incorrect there. I misremembered that. There's only one thing now. I can't remember the other one. But either way, I'm asking you for this. Like, show me a link that shows that poverty is not directly that there isn't an obvious correlation between crime and poverty.
Look at the homicide rates in the 1950s versus the 1970s. Like, track them through. But the homicide rates are going down. Are you denying that people were wealthier in the 70s than they were in the 50s?
Sure, Sean. Let me ask you a question. What does the word externality mean to you? Tell me that just really quickly. What does the word externality mean to you?
Factor that is not the fault of two people participating in a transaction.
Okay, so then if there's an externality, right, like that can be causing or influencing this thing, right? So it's like, hey, here's a rate. We say that this thing and this thing, these things are really correlated. So the more of A, then the more of B you get, right? But now we have this externality Z, right? If you then say Z, you can't then just go look and say, well, AZ should be, you get what I'm saying? Like you can't look at like the two, you can't look at just A and B in isolation when now Z is present, because A can interact differently with Z, then B can interact with Z. So just simply saying B is higher than A, A is higher than A here, so then there should be no difference when Z is present. That's not the way things work.
So your point is crime predicts poverty, except when it doesn't.
My point is, crime predicts poverty, and there can be
poverty predicts crime.
My
point is, crime drives poverty.
I think that the two are symbiotic, but I'm saying that there are externalities, and if you don't understand that, then that's crazy to me. But if you can show me, you said that there was that this was a direct period, right, from the 1930s to the 1950s. If you can show me that there is not a correlation between a decrease in poverty and a decrease in crime during that time, then I'm willing to concede that maybe I'm just wrong here. But I'm asking for that. If you have anything like that.
Right here, you can look at the homicide rates for the last 100 years. I just threw that in the chat.
I'm gonna jump. Right. Okay, so number one, Sean, you can't just link a broad trend and say that this establishes a fact. Okay, so I will say that firstly. Secondly, I don't think that poverty is tied to crime. I think that poverty tends to be tied to certain failing institutions, and the failure of those institutions is usually what predicts crime. But you can have things, for instance, like we can have like very poor rural communities, but like most people are working jobs. Most people, go to church, or they have a sense of community. Like there is a local school. They're not all out there like killing each other. I think the problem that you get is when you have high poverty areas that are having a failure in their institutions. So the three big ones that I'll point out is like the institution of family. So not having like two parents in the household that can oversee and take care of their children. I'll say the institution of your job markets. Are there actually things for people to do? Even if they're shitty, poor jobs, is there at least some type of job for them to work? And then the institution of your schools. Now, people meme about this. I don't know why, but having shit like after school programs and having stuff for kids to do, even if I think conservatives made fun of it, like, oh, they don't have enough basketball courts, even something as dumb as like a park or a basketball court can be really, really, really important to occupy kids' times. I don't think that poverty drives crime, or at least when I've looked at shit before, I've never seen that. But I think that that poverty can tend to cause a collapse in certain institutions, and those institutions can be highly predictive of things that will drive crime. So like as an example of this, I'm just throwing this in chat. Also, if you guys put the arrows, the greater than, less than signs around your links, it won't like show the huge pictures or whatever. This is like a National Institute of Justice brief that showed like, oh, these are things that work when it comes to preventing crime, and these are things that don't work. Last night, it's been a while since I looked at this, but I don't think anywhere in here it was like, get rid of poverty. I think it generally had to do with like supporting after school programs, having like job training for ex-offenders, so people coming out of prison, and things that encourage like not truancy, but the opposite of truancy, like getting kids to go to school and stuff like that. I think that was most of like the statistically effective research that was done in terms of how to prevent crime in areas.
All right.
Sorry, actually, I wanted to kind of agree with that in a sense that one of the, like, being in a poor neighborhood does not necessarily mean you're going to be a criminal. You look worldwide. Usually a large part of it is actually comparison. Poor being next to rich. Like developing countries tend to have a lot more crime than countries where everyone is just kind of poor. And, there's not like that comparison going on. But I just wanted to quickly make this point while I had a second. That study that you had a problem with, Fanatic, that had, it was using criminals in that case. I found one which the data used for the study came from a survey of English-speaking adults who resided in the city of Chicago. The study was originally designed to examine the feasibility and use of biological testing within the context of a household drug abuse survey. And African Americans, compared with all others, showed significantly lower rates of cocaine concordance, marijuana concordance, and combined concordance. Concordance being their answers with usage lining up with the actual results of the test. So I can post that in the group. So that just backs up the original study, except with data gathered from non-convicted people.
Sure, yeah, please link that. Let me see that too. So I think this is where the biggest problem comes into these things. I think because this topic was so incredibly broad, I really hate that because it's really not conducive to a conversation to come with a whole bunch of studies and things that I literally can't read right now and fully engage with these things. So I guess the broader concept, but if we were to have a conversation about a specific topic, specifically or over one of these studies, right? Then I think, for example, I think something that we had all came prepared to talk to, or at least all of us are familiar with, is like that nature study regarding the traffic stops, right? Like that's something that we are all fully aware of. I think some of us probably were better at reading it than others, but at the end of the day, we all have at least been able to come to the conclusion, or our own conclusions based off of our own interaction with those studies. And last time, Lauren, we had like kind of linked you that. We had talked about it. You said you were going to look at it. Were you able to look at that study?
The nature study on traffic stops? No, yeah. I didn't have time to look at it. I do believe that Sean did quite a bit of a deep dive into that. Let me know if I'm correct or not there, right. Sean.
Sure.
I talked about this before. Like what the nature study does, I want to talk about the methodology, is it gathers the data that law enforcement officers are already gathering about their ticketing practices. And if when officers write a ticket or they have a stop, they fill out a little report and all that. They examine that and they use as their determining factor for whether or not there's going to be a racially disparate outcome or whether or not they're going to claim like racial bias or whatever. The day versus night, and what they found is that there's a 5 to 10% disparity in black drivers being pulled over day versus night. So 10%, 5 to 10% more get pulled over in the day versus the night. Now, my contention with this, which I cited in my video and has confused a bunch of people on the left, is that this, admittedly by the study, is a starting point and does not take into account who was on the road because the original data that they're analyzing does not capture that information. Now, Fanatic likes to say that I like to ask for portions of methodology that are completely impossible to get, but I specifically cite the New Jersey traffic study, which was ordered by the Department of Justice, where they did the very thing that I'm asking for. So before we make claims of discrimination based on this disparity day versus night, I think it would be intelligent if we actually got an assessment of who was on the road day versus night, so that we didn't end up learning that black people drive 5 to 10% less in the evening versus the daytime. That's my point.
So something for the nature study. Okay, so you're saying that the problem with looking at black people versus white people getting pulled over is that if you wait until it's nighttime, it might be the case, for instance, that more black people are driving at night versus like white people driving at night, and that might lead to why like less are stopped, or like the other way, if that might be the way that determines it. Okay, this is absolutely true, and they point this out that this is a problem potentially with looking at just day and night things. But the weird thing, I don't understand. The very next part talks about how they solve that problem. So they apply a test that was developed by Grogger and Ridgway called the Veil of Darkness test. And what they do is, because there are different hours for nightfall across the United States when you control for things like daylight savings time, the only part that study looks at is it only looks at traffic stops that happen as the daylight savings time changes, to see, because then you're able to control for time. So for instance, who gets pulled over at 6 p.m. on a summer night versus 6 p.m. on a winter night, and that's where those 20% margins came from. It's I think it's 5 points. It's like 20 to 25%, which is like a 20% drop in getting pulled over. But that's where they actually figure out, like, oh, holy shit, black people are less likely to get pulled over as the sun goes down. And that holds true regardless of the changing hours of day, even into the daylight savings time hours. So it seems to point to the fact that, well, there might be some sort of profiling going on when it comes to pulling people over in their cars.
I mean, again, you would have to, I want them to capture who's on the road, because people behave differently in the summer versus the wintertime as well.
So like, so and I understand that, but unfortunately, like, this is a game where, like, if you want to play this, there's no end in sight, right? Like,
it's not, no. There's specifically an end. If you capture who's on the road, yeah, but that's not possible, I'm in for it. We're never gonna. It is possible. What are you talking about?
You're never gonna capture every single driver.
So this is from the Grogger and Ridgway test. In the case of the Oakland data, our approach yields little evidence of racial profiling, and our sensitivity analysis suggests that the departures from our maintained assumptions would have to be substantial to overturn our conclusions.
Okay, wait. I don't know about. Wait. Grogger and Ridgway developed the Veil of Darkness test, but the nature study is a separate study that compiles.
Well, why would they come to a different conclusion using the same test?
Because they might be using a different data set. The nature study incorporates, it's like 36 different states and over 95 million traffic stops. I don't know what data set Grogger and Ridgway were working with, but like, you can look at the, I mean, I can link the figures. Hold on, I can link the figures in the Discord group, and you can just look at like the difference in pullover rates, and then we can argue about those if you want. But I mean, like, it seems pretty hard that they tried like really hard to control for time of day when it came to
Wait, just really quickly,
so the Veil of Darkness test has been applied by the original researchers and found no racial bias.
Well,
yeah, so a test is just like a method that you develop to figure out, like, it might be like a novel solution for a certain type of problem. I'm trying to think, like, I might develop a test to find out if like people
What's
are
the
being more
effect size? What's the effect size that the nature study offers? I haven't read it enough. I should, but what is the effect size that they show?
It's a lot of stops.
Or is
We're in
it
the
just an assumption?
Millions of stops.
It was 95. It was 95 million. But
the effect size.
the broader study was over 225 million traffic stops, and then they actually controlled down to 95 million.
So I'm linking. So this is just a figure from the study. So if you look at this figure, you can see the difference in the percentage of drivers that were stopped that were black. So if you look across like these three graphs, right, you can see the difference is about 5 percentage points each time, or anywhere from like 4 to 7 percentage points each time. So it would be like about a 20% reduction in the percentage of people who are black. You go from like 25 to 20 based on it being nightfall. Yeah.
Okay, I'm looking at it right now. Give me a minute.
Yeah. Fanatic, your mic is catching tons of background noise. I don't know why.
Very true.
Okay.
Are these numbers are they in the millions, even if they're not saying million right here? Like this 112,938?
No. So the reason why you don't find as many here is because when they were applying this veil of darkness test, like you said, there might be different driving behaviors at different times of day. So they tried to narrow down. They have to narrow down the data set. And they tried to specifically find stops that apply to this hour gap where they could figure out like, okay, well, this is when it would normally be sun up. This is when it would normally be sun down. And then they excluded this middle part where it's like kind of like duskish, like you don't really know if the sun is completely up or down. And they're looking at like, I think it's a 30-minute window before and after. But obviously, like not every traffic stop will occur. Like if a traffic stop occurred at noon, that's not going to tell you anything versus when you're using the veil of darkness test.
And furthermore, like Sean, you were reading this study and you had said like that you like read through the methodology because I remember you had screenshot a specific portion of the methodology, and then the very next sentences are where they go into these specific parts about specifically controlling for daylight time versus daylight saving times. And then they also pointed out that in different regions that the time would be different, like obviously the time for dusk. So they literally controlled for when dusk would be in each individual state in order to make sure that they got an accurate, specific timeline. So that's how they controlled for it.
We've got a problem here because, well, this study, that seems to be one of the few things that this study controlled for, but I don't think it actually controlled for traffic violations.
Well,
Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's something that they acknowledge that they don't know in the thing.
Well, to be clear,
so it sounds like they're assuming racism.
No. Stop. Wait. Hold on. Oh my God.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
They don't account for the traffic violations. So this is the part that Sean quoted on Twitter that was correct. However, the only time when they can, quote unquote, could see that's when they're talking about the overall stop rates. When they talk about the overall stop rates, in that paragraph, they said that these numbers are a starting point for understanding racial disparities in traffic stops, but they do not per se provide strong evidence of racially disparate treatment. That is true, but when they say a starting point, they don't mean that this study is the starting point. That's just the starting point of the study. Because in the next few paragraphs, one, they talk about the veil of darkness test that they apply, but then if you want to go into the next few paragraphs, if you want to get into some fucking calculus, there's a whole bunch of other like statistical methods that they apply as well to try to eliminate like the potentiality for differences and why the data might look the way that it does. Now, again, as I said earlier to Sean, you're never going to get like a 100% like this is every single driver that was driving, this was every single thing that they were doing. I'm literally playing City Skyline and everything, but like the veil of darkness test, it looks pretty weird.
No. You get an accounting of who's on the road, like they did. Like again, I'm asking them to use 1998 style technology, like they did in New Jersey, in order to get this. Like you can capture who's on the road and objectively determine who's creating violations in order to get an idea of what's actually going on. Also, and I didn't bring this up before, but there are certain other violations and that have nothing to do with race that you might not be able to see in the evening versus in the daytime, like expired registration tags and all that. We know that black people are disproportionately poor, so they might be more likely to have expired I don't know why the words can't come out of my face. Expired registration and things like that. So we don't, like I said, like we need more information, and it's not crazy to ask for a follow-up, especially when people are asserting that this is by far and away the proof because everybody acts the same as they do in summer versus winter. Checkmate, everyone.
You can do this, but the problem is, again, firstly, every single thing you just said has also been mentioned as a potential limitation of the study, right? Results could be skewed if race-specific driving behavior is related more to lighting than time of day. Maybe black people just like to drive more when it's daylight out. That could be the case. Conversely, artificial lighting, for example, from street lamps, can weaken the relationship between sunlight and visibility, right? Maybe it's the case that your study shows a whole bunch of racism, but when you go and look at the streets, well, hold on, there's street lights everywhere. Like maybe that's actually not the reason, right? You can see into the thing regardless. But however, at this point, you have to say, okay, well, the evidence looks bad from my side. We need to do further digging because right now it kind of looks like there's a little bit of. Okay.
Do you think that?
Okay,
wait,
and in that case,
do you think
wait, I gotta ask you that. Wait, I gotta ask you.
Has there ever been shootings? Do you think there's more shootings in the summer versus the winter on average?
I don't care. What I have to ask you is, has there ever been any type of like traffic analysis study that has ever reached your bar of expectations for research?
I just said the New Jersey traffic study. I cited a specific example of them capturing the drivers on the road.
Yeah, please. No, he needs to link that to you, Destiny.
One was a survey through self-reporting. One was a survey where they use high-resolution cameras to capture the images to see if their self-reporting was accurate.
Yeah, Destiny, that study has so many problems.
Was this on every single street?
No.
This was enforced by the Department of Justice via consent decree against a New Jersey Highway Patrol who they believed were discriminating against people.
So
he's misconstruing things, Destiny. That's not accurate.
But if I wanted to go to the next,
you're denying the Department of Justice report exists from 1998?
If I wanted to go to the next level of conservative, though, couldn't I just argue, let's say that study happens and it finds like some racial gap, or it doesn't, and I want to play the other end. Couldn't I say, well, actually, black people are more likely to not drive on the freeway? Couldn't I just like...
No, you could not, because you're examining who's on the road, not just who's pulled over, and then their violations. So you literally could not say they're less likely to do this on the highway because you're counting the disparity in behavior versus population.
But how do you know that black people use the turnpike? How do you know that black people use the turnpike at the same rate that white people? How do you know that black people aren't more likely to be on the other part of the road? Furthermore,
you're taking photos of
them. Right. But the other problem was, I got you. But
you're asking them at toll booths to fill out and say if they're black. So you don't have to guess whether or not they're taking it or not because you're actually capturing the data, which is the whole point of what I'm saying.
Yes, but the problem with the methodology
is not working because you're not listening.
Well, the problem with your methodology, first off, is because this was literally going to be based off of people trying to eyeball the race of the individuals based off of high risk.
That's why they asked them in the survey for self-reporting at the toll booth. They did two versions of the study.
Okay, good. So then you need to show me the second version because I know what the first one. The reason why this study had been rejected. The reason why this study had been rejected was specifically because they said that there were too many errors in methodology. There was too much discretion requiring people in plenty of the cases, because some of these toll roads are literally automatic, that they had to literally, based on the idea like of people based off of people looking at high-res photographs, they were then able to look at the pictures and then try to write down the race of the individuals and then link that with the rate of travel of these individuals. But they had to throw out a bunch of the pictures because in a bunch of the pictures the races were ambiguous, so they couldn't tell the races of the individuals. So then automatically that throws out a big portion of your data right there. The methodology was crap. That's why this wasn't something that was wholesale accepted.
They did it in two different ways. The first way was they had people fill out surveys at toll booths and they would identify their own race. Then they had two different coders review these high resolution images. And obviously, if you have a bad image that you can't categorize, you don't categorize them. No methodology is 100% perfect. You're pretending that's what I'm saying when it's not what I'm saying. So these two coders determined this. By the way, the self-reporting data match what the coders determined more or less. And what they found in this survey, which was just about speeding, by the way, you're fighting something specifically about speeding because you don't want to admit that you're wrong, was that the biggest predictor of speeding behavior was none of the models that they used with the census data, none of the projections of who they thought would be on the road, but it was in fact the police writing tickets. Like that's what indicated who was actually speeding.
And didn't your study say that it didn't apply to people in urban areas though? Didn't your study also say that
this was on a highway?
But didn't this study also say that as another portion that they found no difference in urban areas from the black drivers?
No.
It didn't say that?
They monitored multiple zones, right? So they had the 65 mile per hour zone. This is where the disparities among blacks and whites were the absolute greatest. In the 55 mile per hour zone that they were also monitoring, there was not much of a significant disparity at all. So in certain zones, behavior was different. Sure.
Right.
Which
so
makes
so
sense
then
if you've ever driven anywhere. There's moments where you
right.
kind
So
of
then at
speed a
that
little
point,
more,
so then you
and
can't
speed
just
a little less.
so you can't just say you have a smoking gun because you looked at a specific segment where you happen to find a disparity where there could be other controlling factors, but that factor wasn't present in the urban communities. And then on top of this, this thing is instead of it being something that's based completely off of like police is recording data or something like that, it's going to be instead now by people trying to eyeball photographs while at the same time you're literally trying to throw out entire pieces of data where they have literally the largest study ever done of its kind based off of the officers' own reporting of their own stops. But somehow now you're unwilling to accept that conclusion, but you're willing to look at something like the turnpike thing. That's crazy.
It's not urban at 55 miles per hour. It's another section of the turnpike. Like, come on. Anyway, but yeah, again, I'm not extrapolating. What I'm saying is that the methodology that I'm proposing, where you capture the data of the drivers on the road, not just the violators, is possible. You're acting like it's a slam dunk in this case. They happen to find in the 65 mile per hour zones that blacks speed way more, but that's neither here nor there. My point is, you can capture the drivers. The data from the nature study was never collected for this purpose. It was analyzed later. It's interesting. I think it warrants more study, but you're against it because you're already drawing conclusions from it right now.
No, the only reason why last thing, Desi, last thing, please, last thing. The only reason why I'm already so skeptical of this thing is because first off, when the study was released, it already said federal officials had questioned its method and asked that it not be withheld. Then he said, we continue to believe that the survey results have not been shown to be valid or reliable. This is coming from Mark A. Posner, a Justice Department attorney. So yeah, like the idea, like it's crazy to me that all these other studies you're completely willing to accept to reject those conclusions, but in this study, in which we have like the actual federal officials claiming literally that the study is complete poop, you're willing to accept this one. That's crazy. That's the last thing, Destiny. It's all yours.
So they forced a consent decree on this New Jersey department. By law, this department had to release this because they have to report data. Then all of a sudden, when it actually showed differences in behavior, this is already after they enforced a consent decree on this department. They called it controversial because it showed differences in behavior. And I talked about this in my video at the time. It just goes to show you how little has changed because people are still uncomfortable about disparities in behavior producing the disparity in outcome.
Okay, or
teacher, can I take a time out? No, okay. One point I want to make, though, is that traffic stop study, no one has still given an effect size, and that's because there isn't an effect size, and percentages are not enough. This is something we discussed last time. Percentages do not show whether it is an important difference or not. The effect size is the important aspect of a study, and the traffic stop study that you guys have cited still does not provide that. I mean, last time we had this discussion, and I kept asking for the effect size on with Fanatic, with the racist dogs, where dogs were the majority of black people were the majority of people being bitten by police dogs. Turns out, obviously this isn't the same case with the traffic stop study, but turns out it was like 9 dog bites or something in the city of Ferguson with a 70% black population. So while the problem with the traffic stop study isn't necessarily the sample size, the effect size is still going to tell someone how significant the results of a study are, not the percentage. You cannot just rely on percentage. Anyone who understands statistics can look at this. So I would really encourage you guys to consider that aspect of it, that this doesn't tell us whether this is a significant result or not, just because you have a lot of people using the study now.
Okay, wait, if you understand this, can you please explain what is the difference between like a confidence interval versus like an effect size versus like statistically significant? Can you explain that for all of us to catch us up?
I'm not a fucking genius. I'm not going to pretend to be, but what I do understand from the very basics of studies is that you do need to ask for the effect size and find out what the effect size is compared to percentages, because percentages do not tell the whole story. That's like my basic understanding. I'm not going to pretend to be a genius, but I will tell you the geniuses will agree with that.
Okay, so the people that published this study and numerous others, I don't always see effect size as something that's like specifically mentioned. Now, I do see words like, or terms like statistically significant, and then with a given confidence interval of 90 to 95%. I don't. So you're saying if it doesn't have effect size written, it's, everything is just thrown out. That this is.
Well, no, you can't simply go off of percentages.
Can you explain why?
Because it doesn't. I'll let Sean jump in here.
I was going to say the example she gave was it was another debate where somebody brought up in the Department of Justice report on Ferguson, 100% of the suspects bitten by dogs where races were recorded were black suspects, right? And this was over a 3-year period, which sounds really dramatic. And then you find out it's 14 people. Like the Ferguson Police Department didn't have that many dog bites.
I agree with that.
That's why she's saying percentages could be deceptive.
Sure, and I agree with that. But unfortunately, the numbers that are being used in this kind of prohibit that from happening unless you think something tricky is going on. To back up what you're saying, even in that special report for the police use of non-fatal force, on some of the percentages, like there was a really huge discrepancy between Hispanics and one or another. I think they even notate that while this might look scary, there are only like 13 people that are involved in this particular thing. The effect size is very, very, very small, so it's hard to extrapolate from that. This does happen for sure, but I don't think it's happening here, and I don't see any reason to believe that it's happening here.
It's because Hispanics didn't do nothing.
True.
Right, Destiny? My Cuban brother.
I thought that, so I'm reading, I don't know enough about effect size, but it seems like there are specific types of studies that would specifically call for effect size, but not all studies would have it, and that you would need 2 specific variables, and you need to see that relation.
It's quantifying to what degree 2 groups are being treated differently. So we have to actually quantify to what degree the white people being pulled over and the black people being pulled over are being treated differently, and how large the difference is, and whether it's statistically significant enough to apply to the entire population as this is literally systemic racism against blacks being pulled over at traffic stops.
So
Instead
to
of
be
just
clear,
we're seeing a slight variation in some cases.
You're never going to find or I've never seen a study on this that's like, this is evidence of systemic oppression. Fanatic, please, your mic. I love you. Okay, you're never going to see a study that will say this is systemic oppression. I've never seen a study that says that. All of the things that you talk about in terms of like, oh, it would be nice to take pictures of people, for instance, is absolutely true. There's a whole part of this study underneath the end where it talks about like, it's not methods, but it's like suggestions for data collection in the future. Because even just police officers writing shit down can be a shitty way to get data sometimes. They talk about when they go through, I think Fanatic said they had over, I don't know if it was over 200 million initially, different stops, but I know it was over 100 million initially. They cut it down to 95. They have to throw out a ton of shit because officers write down crazy shit, like half Asian, half baby, or stupid shit that doesn't even make sense on the fucking, on the actual like write-up. That is true, okay? There are limitations to the data. The reason why we work with a data set like this is because there's no other way to gain access to this much data. Now, you talked about in New Jersey, in one turnpike, they put a camera and they measured shit, and sure, they did, and it looks like they did. My guess is that doing something like that is expensive. If we could do something like that all over the United States, that would be cool. That would be awesome. I don't think any researcher would disagree with you there, because having like that type of fine-tooth data you can go through with a comb is really, really, really awesome. But it doesn't, so we work with the tools that we have. This happens literally in medicine. This happens in criminology. And it would seem to be the case that in this particular study, when you look at the changing of daytime, now maybe there are different, as Sean said, maybe it's that black people tend to drive with their taillights out more, and that's why you catch them more at night. Maybe that is the case, but it bears further investigation. And right now, I think an objective person is going to be like, yeah, it looks like there might be something a little bit strange going on there.
You don't think an objective person would say, hey, black drivers tend to commit more traffic violations, and this tends to be the thing that closes all the other gaps in arrest and criminality, so that's probably the reason here, instead of racism, all these cops are racist? Because I gotta say, I think it's probably a more bizarre jump to say that all these cops are just racist than to say, hey, black people commit more traffic violations.
I can assert with 100% confidence that any objective person you brought in wouldn't instantly assume, oh, all them black people, they're driving like criminals. Absolutely not. I think you would look at something like this. I highly encourage, if you guys are bored after this, and you can go through and do a whole video debunking all of it.
That's not an assumption.
Look through the methodology of how they apply this veil of darkness, and then you can go through the statistical analysis they do after.
The original creators
they compared summer versus winter. And look, I'm not saying anything. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a scientist. I never played a scientist on TV. But black people don't like the cold. Look at the NHL. They're not there. Facts.
Yo, you're right, Sean. I don't know if you're memeing. I hope to God you're memeing, but you're right. I think that's it. So if you really look at like summer versus winter, and depending on the difference in time, you're right. Then that like kind of throws this whole veil of darkness thing completely out the way. You got it, man. Good job. I didn't think about that, but yeah, you're right. Because I don't like the cold. I hate it. So yeah, that's a good point.
That's just science. There's no follow-up point to that.
Jesse Lee Peterson told me that black people hate the cold. He did say that to me.
Yeah, it's accurate. He's right about that. And he's right about a lot of things, but who knows?
Point I'm making, I don't know whether Sean was memeing there or not, but the point I'm making is exactly the point I made at the beginning, which was racism of the gaps. In a lot of these cases, there are 1,000 other potential explanations that could go in that space. We still need to have that discussion. I could be completely wrong. Like, I'll throw that out there. It could totally be the case that these officers are literally just like, black person, I'm pulling him over, don't like him. And, you know, less likely.
Wait, I gotta stop. Hold on. I gotta stop. Wait a minute. I gotta stop you right now, okay? Because you characterize this so juvenilely every single time. You keep saying like all these cops are racist. They just want to pull black people. That's not what it means to be racist. This is like a child's understanding of what it means to be racist. It might be the case that like you see a black person, you're like, I don't know about him. And you see a white person, like, oh, he's probably up to like doing good things. He's probably chill. You could literally have like some implicit bias that works on that level. It doesn't mean, okay, but every time you characterize it, you're like, oh, those evil racist cops. Nobody in here, well, I don't know if Fanatic believes this. I don't believe that there are like all these horrible racist cops that are like driving over to pull over black people. It might just be the case you see somebody like, black person, expensive car. I don't know, man.
Okay, so Destiny, I'm willing to accept you believe that, but do you really think
why does he put that on me?
So I'm willing to accept absolutely that you believe that. But like when I see people talk about this issue, it is in a public sense.
See, this is that thing she's going to do again when she's going to start talking about like everyone else, man. Like everyone else. But please don't accuse me of that. Like, don't accuse us of that.
No. I don't care about what you've seen like the craziest person on Twitter. I'm not here to stand for those people, okay? I fight against those people. So if you want to, like, you can do a whole video on all the crazy shit that people say on Twitter. That's not going to make anything you're saying less ridiculous.
Destiny, I wasn't pretending to be you when I said that. I was saying I could definitely fill that gap if I wanted to with cops are just racist. I was saying that. I wasn't saying that's you saying that. I was using that as an example.
But what you're doing,
and responding with such defensiveness, like I don't get that. I wasn't asserting that you're saying that. I can explain
why. The problem is because every time you consistently do this, again, I haven't said anything. Every time these arguments, you present the other side, it's like, well, it could be this multifaceted problem where people are driving their taillights out. Maybe there's a difference in behavior. Or I could believe your side that every cop is a racist fucking dipshit, huh? Like, yeah, if you make our side sound that way, of course it sounds like ridiculous, right?
Okay,
I can do the exact same for you. And I can say like, you know, it might be that cops have like an implicit bias when they pull over people. Or maybe every black person just knocks their taillight out and drives around with no fucking brake lights in the dark, right? Like, I can make your side sound just ridiculous. I'm just saying that when you talk about my side, stop characterizing it as the insane lefty Twitter sphere that I know that we both deal with because I'm definitely familiar with this one. Don't characterize it that way. I'm not saying that all cops are driving as evil racist monsters. I'm just saying that like when cops drive around, like sometimes you might be making these implicit bias decisions, which is why when it's a little darker outside, you can't tell the difference between the race of the person in the car, as this study definitely suggests with over 95 million traffic stops while controlling for time of day because of the veil of darkness test. Maybe it is the case that they make these implicitly different decisions. I'm not saying they're all fucking racist, horrible people. That's it.
Okay, fair. You know, actually, I'll take that as fair enough. Like if your position is that it's not intentional racism and it's potentially just subconscious. They're pulling them over because perhaps as a police officer, they approached situations more where when they pulled people over, they found more drugs or they found more criminality in some cases when they pulled over black people. So they made the assumption this person is more likely to be committing a crime than a white person. Perhaps that is at play. I'm willing to concede that.
Okay, that's a great concede. But can we
real quick? What the second part of the study, which we're not going to get to, but it's interesting you bring that up because the second part of the study has to do with hit rates when it comes to pulling people over. And guess what? The hit rates on black and Hispanic people are always like way fucking lower than white people, which is the contraindication of what you just said. Maybe they pull over black people more often because they're more likely to get drugs. That's not the case. It's actually more likely the case that when they pull over black or Hispanic people, they're less likely to get drugs, but they still pull them over. But that's a whole second part of the study that I don't think we're going to have time to get to today.
We don't have to get to it today because I actually mentioned that to her the last time in our conversation, and I specifically mentioned the hit rate, which you asked me for, and then I told you specifically that African Americans were less likely to be found with contraband, yet they still constituted so many more of these search.
I was more so implying criminality in general, as we do know African Americans tend to commit more crime than their population size.
Wait, so now you're justifying that bias. So now you're using the idea that just because there's like a higher rate of criminality amongst African Americans that we should just be able to pull them over as a whole without any evidence to support that?
I was actually sitting here and trying to generously characterize your side. I was sitting here and trying to say, okay, perhaps this, because Destiny called me out and said, listen, that's not our position. We're not saying cops are just being racist. We're saying that there could be an implicit bias. So I've been sitting here trying to justify perhaps what that implicit bias in cops' minds could be to try to explain the argument that you're making and understand it. So I'm actually trying to be generous to you here and say, okay, perhaps this is the thought process that cops are going through. Because if cops are going through that thought process of, well, maybe it's just because blacks commit more crimes, so I'm going to, then what is the implication? It's the original thing I was saying, which is they're just racist and they hate black people and they're pulling them over, right?
No,
so
that's
like
not the other.
if there aren't, so otherwise, what are the reasons cops are thinking this? Are we saying there's an implicit bias because they arrest more people in general, or just an implicit bias because they just don't like black people?
Well, no, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be about them not liking black people. There's just been so many different things that's shown like why there's implicit bias, and I can totally understand. Just me being generous myself, I'm going to do your type of generosity. I could totally understand if I was a cop and I was constantly assigned to work dealing with really bad actors in specifically black neighborhoods, that it would eventually start skewing my point of view specifically about those people, such that I would start developing maybe some sort of unconscious bias, where it's not like I think all of these people are evil or whatever, because I probably dealt with some good people, but I just already have, because whenever I'm looking for crime, I'm happening to do it in these neighborhoods, then it would cause me to probably start feeling a little bit more biased against these people, and then that might result in things that, especially when you start talking about discretionary things like traffic stops, you'll find those results, and then it's exacerbated by the idea. But I got you, and I'm good. Then we agree, and it's exacerbated by the fact when you find out in places like Florida that multiple different precincts were literally using black mugshots as their target practice in their shooting ranges and things like that, where it would probably impact your implicit biases. So then that way, yeah, you're going to get these differences in outcomes. But guess what? If it's just something as loose and as soft as implicit bias, then that means that it would still be disproportionately, systemically disadvantageous to black people, right?
Okay, so I really want to clarify this. Sorry, because Destiny was offended by me characterizing your side of the argument as cops just being racist. And I'll accept that if that's true, that you guys don't believe that. That's fine. But I just want to clarify. So that's not what you guys think. You don't think cops are just being racist.
I can't speak for Fanatic, okay? I will say on my end, and I believe what most reasonable people say, and I hope Fanatic agree with me, I do not believe the vast majority of cops in the United States are fucking card-carrying neo-Nazi or KKK members, okay? That being said, when you are a police officer, we might have said this before, and I'm going to say this again, and this is just fucking talk to cops or whatever. A lot of what goes into policing has to do with making judgment calls on the fly. It is a very, like, you do it when you're working, when you're doing like a beat, when you're doing patrol, like a lot of what you do is like a totally feelings-based thing. You're not walking around with a fucking clipboard and a scientist in your backseat and a sociologist to make sure that you're being fair. A lot of it is you just kind of do what you feel. And it is totally possible that while you deal with people, you do develop these sorts of biases. And I don't necessarily fault cops for it. Like, you're a horrible fucking person, because when you see a black person in a hoodie, you assume they're more likely to have a gun than when you see like a white pimply kid with fucking glasses on, even if it might be like a little bit of a bias thing. I don't necessarily fault cops for it. It's just something like, if it happens, it's good to be aware of it. And if it's happening in bad ways, like for instance, if you're an innocent black dude, you're driving a nice car and you tend to get pulled over more than you otherwise should, then it's something we should look at and something we should maybe change. That's all I'm saying. Not that cops are racist, horrible monsters. Yeah.
Actually disagreeing.
They're asserting that the bias happened. They're asserting that the bias is represented when the cop pulls somebody over and they ask them to search the vehicle, because most of these searches are consent searches. So like they would ask for based on a lower standard of suspicion for a white person. Like hence there's more searches.
There's a lower threshold,
hence those searches yield less results. Right. And anytime you search any group like in higher numbers, like you're going to get lower yield results. Like that does happen.
Wait,
Because,
proportionally?
Like,
Proportionally?
Like, if it's proportional, it should be like the case that like if every like 1 out of 10 people that you like pull over, if you do that roughly, and even if there's different percentages in that group, unless there's some statistical like artifact that I'm missing, it should still roughly be the same hit rates, unless you're applying a different threshold to different groups of people.
Well, there's other things that I've talked about that go into it, but like I don't want to argue about traffic studies for the rest of the day. Like I would be interested in who's consenting to the searches, because a lot of people are like, I don't have anything, like search my vehicle, like kind of thing, and they get searched and all that because they don't want to go through the hassle. And that could be due to the fact that they have like a negative view of the police and that they don't want to seem more guilty and they think that will get them in more trouble. So there actually could be reasons for even that, but like. Yeah, like if anytime you're searching a group disproportionately more, you're going to get a lower hit rate, and like
but
that's really annoying. I've talked about it specifically.
Hold on, wait. To be clear, that's not true at all. If you have a group where there's 90% of one people.
I'm sorry,
there's
raw
10%.
numbers and more. The more searches you're conducting.
No one would ever talk about raw numbers. We would always talk about proportions. Always. No one's ever going to be talking about raw numbers here. When we're talking about hit rate, rate is a word like based on ratio.
No.
It's going to be based on proportions. No one's talking about raw numbers.
You misunderstand. All right, I'll give you an example. In stop and frisk, when there was like 90,000 stops under like the last year of Giuliani, the hit rate for contraband was higher, right? The proportions were all the same. Under Bloomberg, when there was 800 or 640,000 stops, right? The hit rates were lower, even though the proportions were all the same. So I'm like, anytime you increase the raw numbers, typically that's due to a lowering of the standards. You're going to get a lower hit rate.
It depends on how you're defining hit rate here.
But the problem is that if you're getting a different hit rate for different subgroups, then unless you have another explanation, it seems as though a different threshold is being provided for doing a search. That's the problem.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm literally stating like what you guys are saying because it wasn't clear.
But the way that we feel that is the argument is that like it seems like there's like the threshold is being lowered due to race is what the argument would be from somebody like.
Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, go.
There actually sounds like there's a lot of agreeing going on here that's being made to sound like disagreeing. Like I don't disagree with the fact that there may be factors possibly that cause cops to pull over Black people or Hispanic people more than white people, whether that be because of their on the ground policing in which they've had bad interactions or something. But the overall argument here was about systemic racism. And does a factor of I've had more interactions with one group negatively and therefore I'm going to pull over them, does that pass the threshold of racism?
Going back, so this is why I hate this term, and this is why I don't like anybody using it. I think we should all just move past it. The correct definition of, I will fight to that on this. Who is it? Now it's Sean. Why? Why is your mic doing this?
I don't know.
Okay. Systemic racism is supposed to mean that there is a system that perpetuates racism that doesn't require any individual racist actors. That's supposed to be, that's the difference between, because if it wasn't that, then it would just be called racism. So the idea behind systemic racism might be that you have a whole system full of people, and they can be the most tree-hugging, left-leaning, loving, non-race people in the world, but somehow, because of how that system was implemented at some point in time, because of the outcomes that it's creating, and then it's perpetuating, and then it's exacerbating, the system itself can be systemically racist without requiring individual actors to be racist. When I attack like the criminal justice system or the police departments, it's usually from that angle of systemic racism. It's not, I don't think that there are that many cops in this country, or there by raw number there might be, but as a percentage, I don't think most cops in this country are horrible fucking racist people. I don't believe that. But there still might be a lot that participate in systems that can kind of exacerbate racial outcomes, like unwittingly or unknowingly or unconsciously. Like they don't want to be doing it. It's just kind of like what happens, especially when you're at.
Yeah. What I would define, I was going to say, what I would define as a problem to make a distinction is a unearned racially disparate outcome. Like, so something that is not the result of behavior. Like that's what would be a problem for me. Like the non-problems are the things that are the consequences of the actions people take. Also in that are the disadvantages of a cosmic injustice. Like, yeah, we all don't get to choose like how we start out, but the idea that we would harm people in the present to make up for sins in the past doesn't make any sense. So again,
but no one's advocating for that though. The idea whenever we're talking about systemic racism and first off, most of the time, even when you want to get into conversations like reparations, which we're not going to have right now, but even in those cases, it's not necessarily about like just because of things in the past. It would be because of present harms that are related to the things in the past that we would be trying to address there. And then furthermore, whenever we're talking about systemic racism, yes, it doesn't necessarily need racist actors in order to perpetuate itself. But that lack of necessity does not imply that there are no racist actors also perpetuating the thing. But typically, go ahead.
I'm gonna lose it. Sorry, I'm gonna lose it because this is what I keep hearing from you guys. We're talking about racism, like the word racism, and you keep going around and being like, yeah, systemic racism apparently isn't actually racism. And I agree with Destiny where he's like, I don't like this word. I'm starting to not like it either because when I've sat here and I've been like, we're talking about systems which involve racism. Racism is an extremely loaded word. Like racism.
You're quoting me earlier. I said literally all of this. I literally said this. A serious
degree of malice. Can I finish? So when I characterize the argument of we are supporting the idea that systemic racism exists in policing and institutions, and I frame that in a way of police officers are being racist, then you guys say, stop straw manning me. Well, maybe the problem is that the left need to stop using the word racism, and you guys should have said at the beginning.
Well, this is why I made this statement. Hold on, let me address this really quickly.
That there's maybe systemic bias that, or like, you know, the word racism is like so loaded.
But that's why I ended up changing the phrase earlier, where I said specifically it shouldn't be about systemic racism. That's why if we would rather, I think it'd probably be more helpful if we were to say something like it was systemically disadvantageous, right? Like we can say something like that.
But nobody.
So do you guys?
I know that no one uses the term, but I know that no one uses that term, but that's why I said it would be helpful, because specifically, obviously, you get the she's literally used my exact phrasing. Specifically, the phrase racism is loaded. So then when we say systemically racist, then it automatically brings up all sorts of imagery and a different mentality for individuals when we're just trying to talk about systems that are literally designed, or intentionally or unintentionally, to covertly or overtly, like disproportionately disadvantage African Americans. So, or not just African Americans, it could be against all these people. But so yes, the presence of bad actors, individual actors, is not necessary for a system that is disadvantageous. Right. And that's what I appealed to earlier in the conversation. Specifically think they're systemically disadvantageous, not racist.
Okay. So this is why a question of intentionality. Sorry, Sean, go ahead.
I said this is why I would want to focus on the this is why I think it's important to narrow the problem to what we can all at least I don't care about the disparate outcomes, right, at all. Unless it's an unearned disparate outcome. And if we were talking about that, we would probably be all in agreement. But the problem is people want to say, oh, Asians study harder for the SATs. They do better than black kids. That's a disparate outcome. The SAT is racist or systemically racist, even though they may not be a person making the test today that decides that. And it's like, no, Asian kids spend 4 times as long as black kids on their homework. We know this. There's no racist slapping the pencil out of a black kid's hand when he's studying at his desk.
Yeah, okay, so this is true, okay? So I'll take the whole fall for this. So at the very beginning of this conversation, I tried to head off you and Fanatic talking, and this is why I asked at the very beginning, and I gave that example of what if we created a law and it impacted 50% of black people doing drug X and 20% of white people doing drug X? It's because I wanted to get out in front of this idea that systemic racism requires racist actors. Now, I understand why that's fucking confusing, because half the people on left Twitter say that every cop is racist and that's where systemic racism comes from, or all these politicians are racist and that's where systemic racism comes from. That is not the case, and the people that say this are fucking morons. And it's why I think even in this conversation, I've tried to use the term systemic oppression rather than systemic racism, because when you say racist, like Lauren said, it does have an implication of intentionality behind it, and systemic racism should be, by definition, a lack of intention, because systemic racism with intention is just racism. You don't need the system word there. It's just people being racist. So I agree with you that the term is really bad for a variety of reasons, and maybe it's been so poisoned it's impossible to have it. To talk about what Sean is saying, so the problem when you talk about cosmic injustice is it implies that everybody is this rational, free-thinking agent that exists in a vacuum, and I think that we have to look at human behavior a little bit more complicatedly. So for instance, let's say that we had a whole group of people, and let's say that we said, we are going to ban the stealing of groceries. That's going to be a banned activity, right? And let's say you had 200 people and you made that a banned thing. Let's say that of these people, 100 are A's and 100 are B's. Let's say that when you implement that law, let's say that 5 A's go and steal groceries and 50 B's go and steal groceries. Now, stealing is bad. You don't want that to ever happen in society. And you know what? Fuck it. If you're going to steal, you're going to jail. Fuck you. Now, it's easy to look at that group and say okay, yeah, well, fuck them. But let's say we can take one step farther back, and let's say that we create a society where the A's are all given $10,000 a month and the B's are all given $1,000 a month for 1 year, and then you equalize whatever, the income or whatever. And then you see these crime rates happen. It's kind of weird to say oh, well, it's just a cosmic injustice. The B's happen to be full of way more criminals than the A, unless you want to go the race realist or the genetic fucking whatever arguments, because it seems like there were antecedent causes that caused these groups of people to have different behaviors that make it a little bit naive or unfair to just say, well, look at the way that you're behaving now. Why are you doing that? And maybe we disagree on this. I don't know how far either of you want to go with this. I don't think that intrinsically black people want to sell drugs and do gang shootings more than white people. I think most people tend to just want to have a family, work a job, do decently. So I think that it does us well to back up a little bit and say, well, why are these people behaving in such different ways? Maybe it's not just a cosmic thing. Maybe there are environmental factors that are worth addressing.
The reason I called it
he's going to say culture and then not know what it means.
Because it truly is. You are born disadvantaged if your parents aren't married when you're born, right? And if you have a $10,000 head start on somebody, that is an advantage. Like the idea, like people like to say equal opportunity. Equal opportunity is nothing. Like it's not something that's ever going to exist. Should we try to create more opportunity as a society? I think that's a noble goal. But the idea that the decisions of people in the past and the merits of people in the past aren't going to carry over to the present is absolutely ridiculous. And like, I guess and by the way, when you say that we should address like a past problem, that's what I'm talking about, a cosmic injustice. You want to create policy today to deal with the circumstances that people were born into, even if those circumstances were created by people that have been long dead in our society. Right, that's what I'm saying, because you're trying to correct something because it feels uncomfortable that people have a different starting point and all that.
For sure, but I was just say really quickly that the thing is, when we're talking about equal opportunity, we're not talking about necessarily like every single factor from individual choices are going to be accounted for. It's really more about systemically equal opportunities. It's not about trying to make it so that no individual will be able to fail or no individual will have a disadvantage, because this is a country of freedom. So the idea is always going to be allowing people to make their own individual decisions. But if we recognize that there is not an equality of opportunity that stems directly from previous like systems that were created or drafted specifically with different racial intent, then the idea that now that there would be some sort of difference in opportunity as a result of a previous law enacted by our federal government, then there should be something to undo that necessarily. We want to try to achieve equality of opportunity there. And then also when we're talking about like the differences in people's choices, even if you want to look at a difference in people's culture, a lot of time people's cultures are going to be directly influenced or impacted by their environment. So then if we created an environment by system laws, by relegating people to specific portions of society and things like that, and then now they have this specific culture that they've developed as a race as a result of some of these previous racist policies, then you can't then look at this culture as it stands and then just say, oh, it's just culture, or oh, this is just something that happened. You have to look at it and say, what influenced this culture? How did we get here? And how would equality of opportunity lead us to better outcomes for these people, such that our previous laws and previous racism in this country that did exist at some points, probably still does in some levels, but like the previous things that were intentionally designed to oppress these individuals aren't still having a lasting impact today.
Yeah, so I guess where I would fundamentally disagree is with the premise that intent to discriminate or even discriminatory laws are what produces the majority of, if any, of the disproportionate outcomes that we see. We have a long history of minority groups who have been discriminated against across the world, not just in the United States, that have done well than their majority group while they're actively being discriminated against. And like what the problem that I fundamentally have is that the solutions need to be internal. Like you're not going to create this like magical opportunity that's going to fix the problems that are internal within people's cultures. Like you can't expect you to have successful outcomes if you're not willing to emulate other successful cultures. Like white students cannot expect to do as well as Asians in school when Asians spend twice as much time on their homework as white students. Like this is just not a realistic thing. So we can like, try to make up for this past issue or that past issue, but we have a ton of evidence that being descended from slaves in the transatlantic slave trade does not necessarily guarantee you a worse fate in the United States of America, and that the internal habits of Black Americans are far more influential. There's been study
what caused those habits, Sean?
About black people brought to the West Indies as slaves that have immigrated to the United States, where they try to compare every single different factor in order to explain maybe it's preference for these immigrants over the native Black population. Maybe it's that these are more ambitious people, so they compare them to Black people who move for a job. And Black people from the West Indies continually achieve in the United States of America. They're descended from slaves. They should have all the problems if it's the discrimination that's the source, but it's not the case, and it hasn't been the case for a long time.
But they're not descendants of one. They're not descendants of American slavery. Two, when you look at
what difference does it make if it's the transatlantic slave trade?
Well, because there were totally different cultures and the way that the slavery was.
Why are Haitians poor?
Well, because that's a whole other conversation. I'm not going to let you straw man. I mean, I'm not going to let you just segue
Because
into
you would
that.
argue
That's
that
nothing.
Haitians are
So
poor,
my
you
point
would-
being, hold
you
on.
would
My point
argue
being,
slavery.
the point that I was making is that literally, if you're looking at immigrants, typically the people who migrate rather, are typically have literally different economic situations than the average African American. So simply just comparing immigrants who at one point were slaves, God, if we were just look and see how many of them don't immigrate, I mean, don't migrate, then you would see something, right? But people who migrate, I'm sorry, I'm saying it really succinctly, people who migrate tend to have better economic opportunities because they typically have more wealth. So when they come here, wealth, this being a capitalist nation, which I'm very proud of, it makes a sense that that would have an effect or an impact on your experience in the country and your success.
So by
I
the
have
end
to
of
leave
this,
pretty soon.
oh yeah, it's been almost 3 hours. But by the end of this, I'll send you a comparative study that controls for all the myth factors that explain why West Indies blacks outperform American blacks, and the idea that they came with more wealth is not true. The idea that there was bias in the society in favor of them was not true. The idea that they were moving to different neighborhoods and they weren't in the same public schools with normal black Americans, also not true. Like the biggest distinction when they go through all these different factors was their behavior. Like the cultural norms of black Americans are not conducive to success. They need to change them if they want to succeed.
What caused those cultural norms, Sean? Let me ask that question really quick because he hasn't answered it. What caused those cultural norms?
Oh, it's Southern culture. Black people have Southern culture, and we have not. And as a society, we've catered to the idea that this is somehow uniquely black culture when it isn't. It's destructive culture.
Okay, so what makes Southern cultures disproportionately impacting African Americans as opposed to white Southerners?
Because no, it did impact white Southerners. Like,
so then, why are there disparate?
Behavior.
Why are there disparate rates?
They had to change their behavior, but for a long time in the history of the United States, the South was far less developed than the North.
Sure,
this is indisputable.
Okay, Southern culture is really vague. What specifically about
Redneck
Southern culture? What is that exactly?
Let's. How much time do we have for everybody?
We gotta go.
Next 5. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. So Sean, this is Oh God.
You guys can keep going. I don't know.
No.
Actually, wait.
It's better than
can I just see if I can find a point of agreement on like 2 topics? Okay, because we're talking about systemic racism. Okay, systemic oppression. Okay, I don't care about like people making individual choices to change their culture. That's not what I'm interested in. Okay, let's see if I can find an agreement on two areas. Okay. There are 2 institutions that I think should represent some form of equality of opportunity that I think we fail at delivering today in the United States. One is the criminal justice system. I don't think that it's good that your experience with the criminal justice system can be largely like determined by.
And the second one is
access to
education.
capital. I think that's kind of dumb. Now, I don't know if the solution is that like you shouldn't be allowed to pay for more lawyers, but it sounds like I know Lauren has experience. I have firsthand experience. I got pulled over for driving with a suspended license. I paid $1,000 to a traffic cop, and I pled that down to a broken tail light. Okay, maybe I was one of those Hispanic people driving around with a broken tail light in the nature study. Okay, I've had dumb experience with the criminal justice system. I think that being based on money, that in and of itself is something that is fucked that we should probably seek to change. Do all 4 of us agree with that? Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's fairly messed up, and
Sure.
That's one of those things as well that I could see being like, well, of course, blacks typically are more impoverished. They don't have as much money in America, so that would disproportionately affect them. But that's not because of I don't think that's like a deliberate hatred against them or deliberate against me because I can't afford my case. You know.
Okay.
I support a right to representation in the Constitution. We should amend it and add it in there.
Okay, and then the second institution I believe fails us, in the United States, I say this because I don't know if it's in Canada, but in the United States, our schools are paid for with property taxes. When my kid was old enough to go to school, I moved out of the poor Mexican neighborhood that I bought a house in because I worked and I just wanted a cheap house. And I moved into the wealthiest neighborhood that I could find that had fucking iPads for every fucking kid, that has like free after school fucking daycare, like 2 meals a day. There are opportunities that my kid has now going to school that other like black and Mexican kids in Omaha will never have, just because of the type of school that he go to. I think that our education, our like pre-K to fucking 8th grade or high school or whatever, being tied to property taxes also exacerbates inequalities that I don't think are fair to the children that go to school. I think that if a child is willing to put in the effort in any school, he should be able to make it as far as any other child. And I think it's a little fucked that they can't. Is that something that we agree is a little fucked up, or do we think that that's okay?
I mean, I would if it was 1979 and this was before New Jersey's Abbott decisions that normalized funding to all these underfunded schools and they didn't improve. But Yeah.
When you say they normalized funding, what do you mean by that?
In the state of New Jersey, in a series of court decisions called the Abbott decisions, they ruled it unconstitutional to be underfunding the schools based on these property taxes, and they flooded billions of dollars into these underfunded schools to normalize them. And they're still underperforming because a lot of the problems, and by the way, I would agree with equal funding, I just want it to work. A lot of the problems are stuff that the students take in with them.
True.
Oh, sure.
This is
But
true.
do you think that those? Oh God, yeah. So ultimately, since I'm just going to give my closing statements.
I would have agreed because I think it's a great argument back in 1979.
Well,
Sure, that's crazy, but that New Jersey isn't like a good example of the rest of the world. I'm just going to give my closing. Okay, go ahead, Destiny.
Yeah.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
was going to say, just to be clear on that education thing, it's not just a funding thing. Like, there is technology, there's training that goes into technology. You need to be able to efficiently utilize the resources that are given to you, and you need to be able to account for, as Sean said, if you have a kid that's coming from a fucked up home and then he's in school for 8 hours a day, like, you're not always going to be able to do what you need to do with that kid. There are other factors that need to be in play as well. Absolutely. It's not just throwing money at schools. Fuck New Jersey. I think there have been a lot of examples around the country of a lot of money being thrown towards certain public school systems, and you don't really get the outcomes that you would expect. Like, holy shit, we 50% increase the funding, and they're not really doing any better. I do think that does happen pretty frequently in the United States.
Yeah, it sounds like, Destiny, that's because probably, like, yes, funding is one problem, but there are other externalities that would probably also contribute to this issue. So simply matching the funding wouldn't be enough. And I think that's one of the things. When you're looking at these sort of problems, it's never going to be a singular problem, a singular factor that just contributes to all these problems. And so, yeah, like, yes, the funding is probably, like, at a base level, one of the huge determining factors. Underfunding in a school is probably going to result in crazy underperformance, right? Like, I'm pretty sure there's some corollary factors there, but then there are other externalities. Sure, I would imagine not having good diet, that would have a real big problem. It would have an impact on your learning experience. If you're like literally sitting in class and your stomach is growling, it's hard to pay attention to who traded however many apples to Mike or Jim or whatever the freak you're going over in school. So, like, yeah, these other externalities would have an impact, but funding is definitely one of them. So I'm glad that New Jersey seems like they took that first step. But I think the idea of looking back to 1979 as if New Jersey did this and every other place in the world did this would be freaking crazy. There are, like, the idea that there wouldn't be some sort of funding directly tied to that towards education is just crazy. But I'll just give my closing statements regarding a few things. One, regarding police, I absolutely think that there are definitely times where there are in the structure of the way police, the policies of the policing, there can be things that we should be able to recognize are going to lead to bad, harmful outcomes. And these don't necessarily mean individual bad acting officers. So I would say, I think the idea that just all of policing is racist is crazy. Some of, like, our family friends are police. So, like, no, that's just stupid. It's not every individual cop. Sure, there are going to be good cops, there are going to be bad cops. It just really, there are going to be some problematic things within the structure that are going to lead to some probably disadvantages for African Americans. Regarding, like, systemic racism, I think the phrase systemic racism is fine. I think the problem is that most of the time it's been characterized by crazy bad actors on the left and then crazy bad actors on the right. I think this is the problem with most of the terminology that we come across. The terminology is fine. We explain exactly what the freak it means, and then people create these little caricatures that they want to attack, which I call straw men. We did see the same thing when it came to, like, Black Lives Matter. People started trying to say that they thought it meant only Black Lives Matter, right? Which is crazy. We knew exactly what that phrase meant, but then, of course, now it got taken over by BLM, that disgusting and hateful organization, and so now we can't even use that phrase anymore because BLM sucks. So, yeah, and so, yeah, I think ultimately I don't think there's any problem with that thing. Regarding systemic racism, I think there are direct ties towards looking at the way redlining has impacted things today, and when we got rid of redlining, then we ended up going into reverse redlining, and I think that's also equally problematic. I'll probably do a video later on that detailing all of the ways that redlining and home ownership is a huge problem. Because if, yes, Sean made the point earlier that, yeah, maybe there's a problem with loans and people and black people not having credit and having lower credit scores. Well, it really is crazy that rent doesn't actually count towards your credit. On-time payments and rent doesn't count towards your credit. Utilities doesn't count towards your credit. The biggest determining factor is on-time payment, but renters didn't have access to those things. So when black people didn't have previous credit, it was impossible for them to get it, then at that point, of course, they're going to have lower credit scores. So then designing a system around credit scores, when you know that historically these people have been excluded from the credit system, it makes all the sense in the world that there would be these disparate things. And of course, I don't know that these things were intentional, but we can obviously see from design that this is something that was likely to happen, and it clearly did. The fact that there's an impact on systemic, that is impacting people's lives today, sure. I'll end with this last emotional note. My grandmother bought her house in 1950. She lived in that house till the day she died. She died 2 years ago. That house was bought on the east side of Los Angeles during the 1950s, before the Fair Housing Act was passed of 1968. Its appreciation rate was dramatically lower than the equivalent size house in a white neighborhood. She lived in an all-black neighborhood because that's where black people were pretty much relegated to. That house was left to my mother 2 years ago. That inheritance was obviously compromised. That was something that was impacted directly before the Fair Housing Act was passed. That inheritance that my mother would leave me as a result of that is going to be somewhat compromised. Fortunately, my parents are good. My family is good, so there's not going to be as big of a problem. But for other people, that is a huge problem. Other people, generational wealth is an impact. So the idea that we can just somehow divorce our lived experiences from the previous historic oppression, even though some of it wasn't that long ago, as evidenced by all of these different lawsuits against all of these banking institutions for reverse redlining, is crazy to me. I just think it's completely dishonest. Either way, it was a great talk, y'all.
Lauren, because you have to go first.
Yeah, I have to go pee so bad. I drank way too much wine and died. Just peace out, you guys. No, I want to make the point that to completely steelman you guys and your argument, I understand there is an academic definition of systemic racism that isn't often taken on by the masses. I do get frustrated sometimes arguing the academic points because I'm like, well, this isn't the point that most people are using to apply this word, right? But I do get that it's kind of an implication of bias rather than deliberate racism within systems. So yes, what you guys have been explaining here, but when it comes to implicit bias within institutions, that almost exists within everything and amongst every group, right? So when I'm a teenager, I'm more likely to be pulled over because teenagers are more likely to be, new drivers, right? If you're part of a certain ethnic group, there may be things that increase likelihood or increase implicit understandings of driving, criminality, whatever. And that doesn't necessarily mean that these assumptions are not based in fact. When you're giving mortgages to people, usually you consider other factors like where they live, their wealth, what their age is. So there's a lot of bias in everything we engage in within the world. Now, to kind of make the implication or assertion that this bias is coming out deliberately because there is I don't know if I would say a dislike or an intentional negligence towards a certain racial group is a very large statement to make, because of course you are essentially telling an entire group of your country that, it's tough shit for you. Like the world is stacked against you deliberately, or at least to a degree where it is like such great negligence that it might as well be deliberate. And if we're going to make that statement, that will have a large effect on people and their mindset and their view of your country, I really think there needs to be strong evidence for that. So when we talk about like the traffic stop study, sure, it could be because of implicit bias in police. And I don't doubt that there are individual instances of that. But they actually don't assert that the reason is racism. We can't fill that gap. So we need to really study that more. We need to look into that more to see what that is before making such a strong assertion that has such a strong impact on the psyche of your nation, I believe. And that goes with a lot of these other cases where there are other explanations we could look at. And we shouldn't just fill it with the racism of the gaps. Do I believe bias exists? Of course. I mean, you look at domestic violence cases, even when a man is being abused, they walk in there and usually arrest the guy first just because they assume. And that probably happens in white-black interactions as well sometimes. But individual circumstances does not apply to every circumstance. And such an assertion that there is this institutionalized racism in the United States, whether it be deliberate or not, is a massive assertion that we cannot just let lay on. Well, it seems maybe more obvious that this 5% gap in traffic stops could potentially be because of implicit bias when we don't actually know that. We're going to need much stronger data than that before we make such an assertion, in my opinion.
Did everybody go already? At their closing?
You can go, Sean.
My closing. Guys, be nice, do well with the world. Listen, I think that we can't go through every fucking study and every fucking meta-analysis, and if we do, we're gonna get bogged down and everything. I think that it's pretty safe to say that when you look at large swaths of society, it seems like there are certain groups of people that are doing worse than other groups of people. If we don't believe that it's because of some intrinsic biological characteristic, which I don't think anybody here believes, I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think anybody here believes that, then it's probably good to say, hey, what can we do to help these people? I do agree that we need to be careful with our messaging. Running around and screaming that every fucking job is racist and every cop is racist and every school is racist is fucking stupid. You shouldn't do that shit. If you're on the left and you do that, you're a fucking moron. But also, if you're on the right and you are, like, oh, there's no racism, it's just people just act differently. Okay, well, why do whole groups of people act differently, right? There's probably some reason in here environmentally we could dig into. There's probably some kind of policy that we can enact to kind of like massage people in different directions. And I think that those are the types of policies we should advocate for. As long as there are people getting fucked in society, we should do something to unfuck it.
Cool. So I don't like closing statements, so I'll keep it really short. I had fun in the conversation. I understand that there are disparities between a whole bunch of racial and ethnic groups and disparities within racial and ethnic groups. And I would say that I really want people to look into this, because what you'll find time and time again when you delve into it, that these disparities are down to behavior. You can't expect the same outcome when you have completely different inputs. And if you want to improve your life, it is on you to make those improvements. Fanatiq mentioned something about credit and like how it's difficult for Black people to get credit. Go to my channel, watch my video on how to get your first credit card. It's actually really important, and a bunch of young people need to know this beyond any racial or ethnic group. And I just wish we would have been able to talk about some more interesting things, like the difference in criminal behavior from city to city, and how police interactions and police tactics in certain cities can drive down crime and all that. But unfortunately, like, we got talking about what we got to talk about. I appreciate everybody for giving the time, but honestly, closing statements are absolutely terrible. Trans rights.